Boom. So I do not get how that works. I just went live, but in the past, before I've gone live, there are people in the chat talking to me. I'm like, how are you doing this? How are you in the chat right now? If I'm not even live. Maybe it's, I assume people can come into the Twitch studio. Like if they go to my Twitch homepage, and pull the chat up that way. But this comment came from YouTube. So bizarre. I don't understand StreamYards. Yo no comprendo. My Spanish is getting better. Sooner or later, we're gonna have all Spanish streams. We're live on YouTube. Really? Have you been live for a while? Huh? Or have we been live for a while on YouTube? YouTube. Huh. That's interesting. Hola. Hola, blueberry onions. ¿Cómo estás? Just here for the good word, Eddie. I'll try and give you the good word. The word of the day is efficiency. Because I've been trying to be more efficient with my time. I got offered to go to a Greco wrestling camp. Greco is the style of wrestling I do right now. And I could have gone for a week. But the streams have really been popping off lately. The streams have been doing well. Just got a notification. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. The streams have been doing well, and I wrestle all the time. I never say no, you know. But I was like, I just wanna stream and continue to work out on my own for the next week, rather than go and be in Nebraska with a bunch of high schoolers for a full week. I'd rather stream and do stuff I care about and continue to grow the stream. So here we are. And I hate saying no to people, but here's what I'm learning. Here's a little life lesson, whether you're a communist or not, that I've learned in my 7 years of being an adult now. It's better to tell people no. It's better to have an understanding of your schedule and your own time and energy. And then when people ask you to do something later on down the line, it's better to tell them no if you know you probably can't do it, rather than tell them yes. And then when it comes time to do that thing, you have to make up an excuse and bail on them. People will respect you more if you tell them no when you can't do something from the outset. So it's uncomfortable, but telling people no is definitely a skill. And that's where I'm at right now with my adulthood. So I'm sure some of y'all have had similar problems. It's like you want to throw your time and energy into things and do your best, right? Whenever you do something, it's good to try and do your best. But then if you do good work, a lot of people are going to want your work. They're going to want your energy. And you only have so much. You can't split it between everything. So do you wear wrestling tights with communist imagery? Yes, they're called singlets actually. My brother, one of his buddies, the singlets are actually pretty expensive. But my brother sent me this last year because one of his buddies got it. Where is it? Where the heck is it? They had like a Communist Party wrestling singlet. They may have had it custom made, like my brother and his teammates. 'Cause I don't even know where it is. But they make like, oh, I gotta share my screen. One sec. They make like, that's not what I want. This. So like I would rock this. This looks cool. But the one my brother had was even more cool. It said like CCCP, and there was like like China's Communist Party members, like building stuff, and like leading the revolution on the singlet. And I guess there's not a picture of it online, which is sad. But it exists, I promise. My brother sent me a Snapchat of it. Can relate. Nice, yeah. I've got some interesting stuff to react to here. Got some stuff I really want to watch today. We've been mostly having conversations and doing interviews lately, but I really want to react to some news stories because we haven't done that in a while, and I think it's good to follow news and politics a little bit. So I have some stuff pulled up that we're gonna watch. A lot of stuff in relation to Ukraine, of course, and the liberal media's unhinged portrayal of the situation in Ukraine. So yeah, we'll watch that. We'll maybe have a guest on. I gotta check my phone here in a second. Yeah, I hope you're all excited. I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick here before we get started with actually reacting to some stuff. But I'll pull up a cool video for y'all to watch right now. Pull up, I don't know, what should I pull up? Pull up what's the video here? I'll pull up a video of me wrestling that y'all have never seen. We'll break into my college days. I've showed you all the senior level stuff, the stuff I do now, but oops, that's not what I wanted. But let's pull this up. I really got to go to the bathroom, so I'm trying to hurry. Oops, got to change the year because I'm old. Geez, I'm really old, older than I thought. All right, which match should we pull up here? Let me find a good one where I really beat someone's butt. Oh, here we go. Here's me wrestling the guy who won nationals the year after I graduated. This was the outstanding wrestler at the Division III national tournament, and his last loss in college was your boy. So here it is. His last loss in college. Me. I'll be right back. Holy shit, that stinks. That was me. About took out my lighting, and I about died because my roommate destroyed our bathroom. About died from the smell. How am I doing in this match, y'all? Rate me. 9 out of 10. That's not what I wanted to click. What the heck? Okay. Well, we'll watch the rest of that match later. I'll leave it up for later. No, not Jimmy Dore yet. We ain't ready. Nice haircut, comrade. Thank you. I can't wear this forward anymore or I look bald, people are going to think like I'm battling or like going through chemotherapy or something. So other than that, I do like the haircut. So thank you. Spark on Bluff is the name of the haircut place. Eddie, please spread the word. Many of indigenous comrades are dying at the hands of police repression in Ecuador. Okay, thank you for sharing this link. We could definitely talk about that. It's 100% true. What this person is saying is something that we've been following here at Midwestern Marks. We just did a podcast with our comrades at the Troika Collective, discussing recent developments in Ecuador, discussing the history of Ecuador, politics in Ecuador. So I recommend people check that out. It was a great discussion that we had with them. And then I'm trying to open the link that you sent us here quick. That this comrade sent us. Gotta open the Twitch chat quick here. But yeah, so the right-wing government in Ecuador, which was a government that the U.S. supported and helped bring to power, which is something that we talk about in our podcast. Oops, that's not what I want. I want this. So the government has responded violently, the right-wing government, because we know the state is a tool for the suppression of one class by another class. And the state in Ecuador is no different. And the U.S. have done everything they could to maintain this bourgeois, right-wing, pro-imperialist state apparatus in Ecuador. We went in depth about the elections and how the U.S. influenced the last Ecuador elections in our podcast with Troika. Yeah, so that's how they're breaking up the protests after days, days of mostly indigenous and working class protesters in Ecuador being in the streets. The government the right-wing Guillermo Lasso government has come out and begun suppressing the protesters. And what they're protesting is neoliberalism, right? They are protesting imperialism and right-wing economic policies. They have privatized and cracked down on the mining industry, which has hurt jobs, which the U.S.-backed eco-socialist leftist candidate in Ecuador's last elections, who the U.S. supported in order to split the left-wing vote and allow Guillermo Lasso, the right-winger, to win the presidency. The U.S.-backed candidate was advocating for getting rid of mining, abolishing mining in order to help the environment. And what we were saying is if you take away industry like that, if you deindustrialize, that's a neoliberal right-wing policy. And that's going to take jobs away. That's going to take jobs away from indigenous people. And then you have the U.S. empire and their puppets out here like, oh, we need to protect this indigenous land by getting rid of mining. Well, let me talk to the indigenous people then. Because it seems to me with these massive protests that are going on in Ecuador that they want jobs, that they want an expansion of industry and their ability to produce and their ability to be a strong country economically and a self-sufficient country economically. And also prices have been on the rise. There are other neoliberal policies that the people of Ecuador have been protesting against, but all of these policies are designed by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And if you don't know how the IMF and the World Bank work as a tool of imperialism, they get these countries trapped in debt. And then basically make these countries subservient to the IMF and World Bank, these giant global financial institutions, which were created after World War II, which are totally controlled by Western capitalists. So Guillermo Lasso, the president of Ecuador, is really nothing more than a puppet of the IMF. And sometimes people have a hard time understanding how imperialism works in the modern era, right? Because it's not just the U.S. going in and doing a war and taking some leader they don't like out. like the war in Iraq was, very, very blatant act of imperialism and imperialist aggression. But a lot of times it's very subtle and covert. So you have the IMF backing Guillermo Lasso. And then you have the State Department's NGOs who are funding this pseudo leftist eco socialist candidate during the election, which helps boost Lasso. And then when the indigenous people protest the IMF's policies, the right wing neoliberal policies, that's when Lasso comes in and shuts down these protests with the police and violently suppresses these protests. So you have all these different apparatuses, all these different arms and allies of the U.S. empire who work together in order to super exploit and suppress a country like Ecuador, and keep the people of Ecuador from rising up and becoming self-sufficient. The people just want Lasso gone. Absolutely. They implement austerity measures. Yes, and that's largely what this has been in response to, is Lasso has implemented a bunch of austerity. One of the examples of austerity is the decrease in the mining sector, and the privatization of mining, which is exactly the opposite of what we saw in Bolivia, right? Bolivia, with the socialist government, has been moving to nationalize their energy sector and industrialize their energy sector, socialist construction, rather than this neoliberal destruction that we've seen in Ecuador. One of the 10 demands of the protest leaders is an end to new mining and oil developments. Lasso did promise some restrictions on mining, but that didn't really pan out. Of course it didn't pan out because Lasso's not even making any policies, right? Lasso is absolutely a puppet of the IMF. And when we talk about an expansion of mining policies, it's an expansion of jobs and extraction industry that needs to be carried out by the people. Like, that's largely what's been done in Bolivia. And there's a debate within Bolivia as to like how many new mining industries do we set up? Where do we set them up? How do we industrialize? How do we go about this, right? And the decision is being made by the people, which is socialism. Here you have a situation where the U.S.-backed, left-wing eco-socialist Malthusian candidate is saying we're going to get rid of all mining completely, which would be a disaster economically for the indigenous folks. And then you have Guillermo Lasso, who's just doing whatever the IMF wants. So ultimately, these even seemingly opposed political forces, other than the socialist groups in Ecuador, are really working together to make sure that the masses of Ecuador aren't the ones who are in charge, aren't the ones who are in control of their own industry and their own economy. Hi, Eddie. Here's a recent TikTok I made where I reacted to anti-Cold War communist era propaganda film from 1957 made by the U.S. Department of Defense. Just a heads up volume warning. Thank you for following me on TikTok. You bet, Jacob. We'll check that out today. I'll add it to the list. The only bummer about StreamYards is it doesn't let me copy links. So I'm going to have to open Twitch in order to do that. If anybody knows how to open links from the chat that people send in StreamYard, please let me know.
So I came across this Cold War era.
Whoops. I love seeing when people in my chat or people who watch my videos, when y'all make content, I love it. It makes me quite happy, because it's like then we're spreading, right? We're spreading that Marxist education. It's not just me giving all y'all Marxist education so you can organize your workplace. It's me giving y'all Marxist education so you can organize your workplace, and then your organizations can give other people Marxist education, and then they can organize their workplace. And then, sooner or later, after enough people get Marxist education and organize their workplace, we'll have socialism. What's happening, champ? Not much. Eddie, look at my channel. I have Minecraft audiobooks. What? I'll check it out later. Hello from Iowa. Have you done any research into Iowa's leftist past? Henry Wallace and Pryor. Not as much as I need to. One of the things that we want to do at Midwestern Marx is basically create Capital Volume 4. Not Volume 4, but Capital, or a dialectical materialist analysis of basically the US, or at least the Midwestern United States. So do what Marx did. Look at the developments in industry. Look at the developments in production. Look at the developments in banking, specifically to the U.S. And I've already started this research. I went all the way back to when I was reading Capital Volume 1. Went all the way back and was studying the economics of slavery in the U.S. and the creation of modern capitalism. So that was the beginning of the dialectical materialist analysis I want to do. And that I wrote an article about it that got published in quite a few places. I'll pull it up and put it in the chat here so people can have it. American Slavery and Global Capitalism was the name of it, and it's on Midwestern Marx, our website, and I'm putting that in the chat right now. But it's also on like Fred Hampton. It's on Countercurrents, the Hampton Institute, some places like that. I know it's on some more places too. So yeah, there you go. There's a link. Greetings, Comrade Eddie, says Ramiro Sebastian Funes. Greetings, Ramiro. Thank you for being here. Please go follow Ramiro if you haven't yet. I know I say that on every stream, but definitely one of my favorite content creators to watch. People ask me sometimes which content creators I actually watch, which for a while it wasn't really any. I was just like trying to read and stay off YouTube. But then I found a lot of content creators who I enjoy. Ramiro's one of the main ones who I watch myself. Like if I'm driving to go grocery shopping or something, I throw on Ramiro videos. And I also watch some Jimmy Dore and Jackson Hinkle for more news stuff, and then I watch a handful of people who we've worked with, like Troika Collective and stuff. Obviously, Carlos and I have to edit the articles that come into Midwestern Marx, so that actually keeps us pretty informed with the news and politics and just reading what people are writing about. But yeah, check out Ramiro Fire. Absolutely. Can you watch Cold War Part 2? You bet I can. Even though those videos got not taken down, they got demonetized. I'm like, come on. That just proves that it's like a big corporation or like a State Department connected or backed corporation who's pushing those like Cold War oversimplified videos. Because immediately when people make responses to those videos, they get demonetized. Which is always, kind of sketchy. All right, got you. Cold War Oversimplified Part 2. I want to watch that one soon. That one's interesting. Oof, Jimmy Dore, LOL. Why Jimmy? I just think he's on to like clearly. I think you're naive if you deny that Jimmy's doing this, and Jackson. Clearly, they're trying to reach people who consider themselves to be conservatives, people who have more right-wing values, and like most of Jimmy's COVID coverage in healthcare administration, I thought it was kind of unnuanced, right? And there's a lot I would have changed about what him and his producers were publishing during COVID for sure. But he was on top of the Nina Jankowicz thing. He's been on top of the Social Democrats or the squad, AOC and them. He's been criticizing them from the beginning when so many of these left new media figures have been afraid to criticize them. And he keeps having Max Blumenthal on to talk about social media censorship of journalists, which I feel like nobody else is talking about that. And then during Ukraine, Jimmy and Jackson's coverage of Ukraine has been the best and the most honest because they're not beholden to the Democrats at all. So it could change, who I think is doing the best reporting right now as far as those new media figures go. And Jimmy also has a lot of Marxist-Leninists on his show, which none of these other new media figures are doing. So I would love to go on Jimmy's show. I would love to start a campaign to get on there, and it's like there's this idea that, if someone like Jimmy, Like I said, Jimmy publishes COVID stuff that I disagree with, right? And he's appealing to people who consider themselves maybe a little more, on the political right wing in the American political spectrum. Maybe people who watch Tucker Carlson. I don't know. He's trying to get those people. But I disagree with his COVID coverage. My COVID coverage is different. But that doesn't mean I don't think we can make an alliance, right? Like, clearly he has a slightly different audience, a different makeup of his audience than I do. We're reaching different people, but we're still reaching, the American masses, largely American workers. And, the people watching me and Jimmy Dore aren't super, super mega wealthy capitalists and shareholders, but they are different audiences, different groups of people. So if we were going to ally on something like fighting for Medicare for all, or organizing workers, or pushing for anything, that our audiences would share in common as a goal, which is like 90% of stuff, why would we not ally with them? There's like this push now to be like, oh, I have to cancel Jimmy because he did COVID coverage that I didn't agree with. Like, I really don't. I can criticize Jimmy. I can explain exactly where I thought his COVID coverage was unnuanced and where his show, or at least his producers, made mistakes. But when it comes to anti-imperialism and socialism and Medicare for all and all the socialist economic policies that matter, we're pretty much in agreement. So, I think we have to get better on the left at forming alliances. And, when we have a disagreement with someone, not saying this is the end all be all, I'll never talk to you again. We can disagree with each other, especially on, issues like COVID, where there's no like specific, explicit Marxist answer, where Marx was like, this should be your opinion on COVID, and this is a Marxist principle, and anybody who doesn't have this principle on COVID is anti-Marxist. We could say that about like class collaborationism or whatever. I don't know. Marxists don't want to give a bunch of power to the bourgeoisie, and anybody who's saying that we should do that, they're not a Marxist. But anyone who's questioning the mask mandate, I don't think that's a Marxist principle that we need to disavow people for. Especially when workers are purposefully kept politically backwards, right? The bourgeoisie and the U.S. media purposefully keeps people uneducated and uninformed so they can't, fight in their own interest. So we know that as leftists, yet anytime somebody says something that's uninformed, we're like, you evil basket of deplorables. Like, well, why don't we just explain why we disagree with them? David Burney, keep up the great work, comrades. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate the super chat. Really appreciate you. You've been supporting us since the beginning, so thank you very much. And yeah, if anyone has, I know, like, I like to interact with the chat a lot. But as the stream continues to grow, if it continues to grow, hopefully it will, knock on wood. It's going to be harder and harder to answer, to interact with everyone. So, sending a super chat is going to be a way to get me to see your comment and to respond to everyone. I know it's kind of capitalist, but Jackson Hinkle likes you. You have an in. That's true. I've been on Jackson's show and Jackson has been on our show, so I should use that as a way to get to Jimmy. I'm just bad at like self-promoting and maneuvering myself like that, and I'm so busy, like I get distracted, which is what we were talking about at the start of the stream, like how I've kind of taken some more time from wrestling, so I can focus on this. Because I just get distracted when I try and do something that takes a lot of time, like starting a campaign to get on Jimmy Dore's show. But maybe I did a TikTok about it the other day. Maybe I'll do another one. Jimmy had Danny Haifong on his show who helped radicalize me. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So that was like one of the Marxist-Leninists I was really thinking about. Because Danny runs Friends of Socialist China. Like, Danny is a straight up, quote unquote tanky, but he's really intelligent about it. And he's a smart, intellectual, well-spoken guy. And Jimmy's having him on the show. Jimmy, regardless of what you think of Jimmy and some of his politics, and you may have your disagreements with him, but he's having Danny Haifong come on his show and talk to people about socialism and about how the U.S. media is lying about China. Like, that is a good thing, regardless of who Jimmy is reaching, even if he's reaching people who are technically registered Republicans. If they're listening to Danny Haifong talk and moving more towards socialism and away from American conservatism, that's a win in my book. Jimmy's gripe on the COVID vaccine is that he was injured due to the shot. Working in healthcare, he's not the only one I've seen talk about it. Yeah, he's never. Yeah, and some of his COVID coverage has gotten smeared and taken out of context. And I have my own opinions on it. As someone who's been studying healthcare administration, and my opinions on it are not what Rachel Maddow and MSNBC would tell you. You know, they sort of like worshipped the vaccine and any sort of vaccine mandates, and then they were like. Anybody who opposes vaccine mandates is evil and is anti-vax. It's like, well, hold on. Even as a healthcare administrator, we're going to mandate that all, and I agree, of course, that the vaccine is good and it helps you not get the symptoms, right? Or it helps the symptoms be less intense, if not helps you avoid the COVID in general. But the vaccine is being produced by like Pfizer and all these giant companies. That's like you're gonna, the Democratic Party, who takes all this money from Pfizer, is all of a sudden saying anybody who doesn't support a mandate needs to be censored and is evil and supports Trump. It's like, let's pump the brakes here. I don't trust the Democratic Party as much as I don't trust the Republican Party. So yeah, it's okay to be skeptical of what they're both saying about COVID, without taking a super, obviously I don't think people should just run into the conservative position and be anti-vax and think that they're microchipping us, but there can be a dialectical middle ground here, folks, is what I'm saying. Will Iowa wrestling bounce back next year? Good question. They're in a strange spot with COVID. Every wrestling team in the country, every college is in a strange spot with COVID. My brother, if he wanted to, he could have like 7 years of college eligibility. He could have wrestled for like 7 years because he had a medical red shirt, and then everybody got an extra year during COVID. So Iowa had all these dudes wrestling who were like in their 7th year of college. And a lot of those people graduated, but they should have Spencer Lee back next year. They'll be good. Spencer should win nationals. And Patrick Kennedy is going to be really good. So sorry if you guys don't know about wrestling. Why is Turkey against Sweden and Finland joining NATO? Good question. I think it's just their relations have been not good. And Turkey has thrown a bunch of wrenches in the U.S.'s plans when it comes to NATO and world dominance. Like, the U.S. has tried to ally and use the Kurds before as sort of like a proxy to do what they want in that region. And Turkey doesn't like the Kurds, so they have given pushback to the U.S. And it's like NATO is just so big and it encompasses so many countries now. Some of those countries are going to have different ideas of what they want. So Turkey is basically saying, no, we don't want Sweden and Finland armed with NATO weaponry and NATO troops, based on our relations with Sweden and Finland. Jackson said liberals and leftists are the same. That was disappointing. Yeah, but I see what he's saying. He's just saying you need to be a Marxist, because a lot of leftists, they say they're leftists and they say that they support left-wing economic policy, but then they don't. When it comes time to it, they actually don't. Like AOC, anytime there's a social issue that comes up, she's on the front lines fighting, or at least filming herself or being filmed, in the streets, like right now with Roe v. Wade. But when it's like Medicare for all or something like that, she's much less willing to risk political capital on it or to fight. Which I'm not saying she shouldn't fight for Roe v. Wade, but it's like have the same energy for Medicare for all, because people are dying in the streets because they can't afford health insurance. 60,000 people a year in the wealthiest country on earth. 100 rural hospitals shut down in over the last 5 years or so because it wasn't profitable. It's like, why aren't the so-called socialists yelling about that? This is the stuff that socialists are supposed to care about, economic problems that are caused by capitalism. But synthetic left, yeah, I definitely think like that's a good term. I think it's a real term. Like, I think there are legitimate leftists who are, on their way to becoming Marxists, who are like sort of baby Marxists. But then I think there's also synthetic leftists who just pretend to care about economic social values, while and here's a perfect example. There were people during the elections who were calling themselves leftists and then voting for like Elizabeth Warren instead of Bernie, or voting for like Joe Biden because we needed a more sensible candidate if we were going to defeat Trump. It's like, that's not leftism. That is supporting the left wing of capital, which is what the Democratic Party is. It's just the left wing, the more progressive wing of capital, of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class. So supporting them over someone like Bernie, who was a legitimate move to the left economically, or at least would have fought for those policies, regardless of how many he actually would have been able to get enacted. Siding with a corporate ghoul like Elizabeth Warren over Bernie, or any of these corporate ghouls, shows that a lot of the leftists aren't actually on the left economically. So Bernie would have kicked both their asses. I believe so too. There are imperialist leftists too. Okay, thank you, Illinois State Fishing. You always bring up the best points. That is another problem. Is a lot of the leftists pretend to be anti-imperialist, right? They'll look back on the Iraq War. Now that we know that Iraq was based on lies and millions of people were killed, and it was a war for the U.S.'s oil interests and Dick Cheney's oil interests and weapons manufacturers, 20 years removed from Iraq, well, I guess we're still occupying them, but 20 years removed from the intervention, leftists or synthetic leftists can look back and say Iraq was bad, right? But then they're putting Ukraine flags in their bio, and they're supporting the U.S.'s proxy war in Ukraine. And so many leftists supported Libya, the U.S. intervention in Libya, which destroyed the country, brought them from one of the most prosperous countries in Africa to a country with tons, with civil war going on, and at one point with an open air slave market, and the country has been totally destroyed. They basically had no central government. The U.S. just left it in complete disaster. And there were leftists cheering this on because Gaddafi, is supposedly a dictator and had right-wing social views. They were saying that Gaddafi was encouraging his army to commit sexual crimes against the civilians, which we've now learned was lies, total lies. But leftists heard that and they were like, oh, go get Gaddafi, go U.S. military, go. It's like, that's not leftist. That's imperialist. That's capitalist. That's literally the opposite of Marxist, socialist, or leftist. So also people like that who cheer on every U.S. intervention while calling themselves a leftist, I think they're synthetic as well. Yeah. Great conversation. Oh, I want to answer that super chat. One sec, though. Sam is in the Crazy Hayes is in the chat. Crazy Hayes, you should come on the stream today. We should talk. That'd be fun. SCOTUS listing China and the DPRK in their report is wild. Can you show me what you mean by that? In their report for what? I'm really, really interested to hear what you're talking about. What report did they publish mentioning China and the DPRK? So I did not see that. Thoughts on Tibet? I need help understanding. Okay. So American liberals love Tibet. I don't know if they just think they kind of have an affinity towards Buddhism. They think Buddhism is like spiritual and magic and cool and needs to be preserved. But in Tibet, the Dalai Lama, basically the religious ruling class, because keep in mind, before China's revolution, they were not a capitalist country. They had capitalism emerging and developing slowly in the cities, but they were mostly a feudal country, a semi-feudal to mostly feudal country. So they had these giant landlords, and the landlords would own a certain section of land, and the peasants would work that land, and they'd get to keep, whatever food that they needed to survive that they created. And then they would give the surplus to the king or to the lord or the landlord who owned the land. And this is why during the Chinese Communist Revolution, a bunch of the peasants rose up and killed the landlords. And Mao let it happen. Mao didn't protect the landlord. He was like, okay, this is, the revolutionary violence or the revolutionary anger of the people who have been exploited and oppressed by these landlords for years. So in Tibet, that was the Dalai Lama. And they lived in a mansion. The Tibetan landlords lived in a mansion surrounded by all the peasants living in poverty. And they used, the religion of Buddhism to say, I don't know how much people know about Buddhism. I've studied it at least more than a surface level. I've been to a few Buddhist temples and sat through the teachings. But basically the idea is, you don't need any physical possessions to be happy. Happiness is detachment from the material world, from material wealth. So that's a great thing to tell peasants as you're living in a mansion, if you want those peasants to just keep working all day and never ask for any material wealth. So that's kind of how Buddhism was used to enforce the mode of production in Tibet. So when the Communist Party came and they liberated Tibet, you'll often hear that the Communist Party came and took over Tibet. No, they liberated the peasants from the Dalai Lama and from the landlords, who were then fled to the West and have been backed by the West and the Tibetan separatist movement ever since, which is mostly just, an imperialist lie. Over 90% of Tibetans don't want, separatism or independence. They want it to remain part of China. And so the U.S. has been trying to go back to the feudal system that the Chinese the Communist Party of China liberated the Tibetan peasants from, and that the Tibetan peasants liberated themselves from. And some of the things that they did, before this liberation, was they would gouge out the peasants' eyes. The Dalai Lama would. So he had slaves in his mansion who had like their eyes gouged out. Because he would gouge out their eyes if they disobeyed him. There was whipping, torture. There was a policy of foot binding all across China at this time, where young women had to bind up their feet every day really tight so their feet would look a certain way. All these terrible cultural practices which communism in China brought an end to. And that's what the U.S. wants to go back to. When they say free Tibet, they mean they want Tibet under the rule of a U.S. puppet leader. A U.S. puppet leader who tortures the people when the people won't allow themselves to be exploited all day. So it's so ironic, when the U.S. and the imperialists say free Tibet, what I always say is, what do you mean? Mao already did. Because they don't want free Tibet. They want occupied Tibet. I'm a wholesome Dalai Lama. Yeah, and Westerners, like I've made TikTok videos on this and they lose their minds. You colonizer. How could you say that about the Dalai Lama? The US has the Dalai Lama come and give speeches all the time. I watched one in history class. He's a nice guy. Yeah, a nice guy who gouged out the eyes of his slaves when they disobeyed him. No wonder the US has him come do speaking engagements all the time. Sounds like their favorite kind of person. Jesus GC, the Dalai Lama was a fucking monster, and there was a goddamn King of the Hill episode about him. No way. That's crazy. Yeah, Americans don't know this. They seriously think the Dalai Lama could commit no wrong because he's spiritual, and the U.S. just looks at the East as mystical, and there's all this Eastern mysticism. No, the East, under China, under feudalism, was based on exploitation, not mysticism. And Buddhism and every other religion was used to enforce the mode of production. Just like in the West, where they were telling people that feudalism and the kings are ordained by God. And the kings need to be in charge because they just have the divine right of God. And the church, who owned 1/3 of the land in France before the revolution, was pushing this idea on the people. Same thing with the Dalai Lama and Buddhism, Marxism. So thank you very much for that question, and thank you for the super chat. And thank you for the super sticker, Stephen Michael Palazzolo. Much appreciated. Really appreciate the support. DPRK, check this link. All right, bet, Sam. One sec, I gotta open it up. Where is it now? Okay, I found it. Ooh, I kind of like this. That's cool. StreamYards is so lit. Oh, so this is Danny Haifong, who shared this tweet from Sam. The SCOTUS ruling on Roe v. Wade explicitly names China and North Korea as problems for codifying abortion as legal. Darn communist Asians at it again. Oh, this is wild. This is wild, Sam. Wow. In short, the viability rule was created outside the ordinary course of litigation and always has been completely unreasoned, fails to take account of state interests, and recognized as legitimate, and indeed telling in other countries was informing viability time. Only a handful of countries, among them China and North Korea, permit elective abortions after 20 weeks. The rest have coalesced around a 2-week line. See the world's abortion laws. Wow. That is so crazy. That is crazy. And it reminds me, during the Soviet Union, one of the reasons that the U.S. got all those policies like, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, some of them came in 1965, and there were a bunch of policies enacted in 35 under FDR. I can't remember which was which exactly, but under FDR, whoops, I didn't mean to hit that. Under FDR, the U.S. couldn't, have a worse standard of living for their workers, for their people, than the Soviet Union, or that would show the success of socialism, which is part of the reason the U.S. tries to destroy any socialist country. Oops, I forgot to open it up. I'm sorry. Here's what I was reading. It's from Danny Haifong, the U.S. talking about their abortion ruling. But yeah, wild. Wild. Crazy commies, huh? GD, I never thought of Buddhism as capitalist propaganda, but it makes total sense. I didn't either, right? I had studied Buddhism, and I went to a Buddhist temple and sat through the teaching. I'm like, this is cool, I'm learning about different religions, different religious structures. And then I learned about Tibet. And I was like, oh, it's just like any other religion. It gets used to exploit and kill and torture people under class society. Can't see the tweet. Yeah, sorry, y'all. I opened it up now. Classic case of Orientalism as well. For sure. Great point. Racism is always used to enforce and support imperialist ideology. When Democrat comedy hosts on TV start talking about fascism and colonialism, it's time to stop associating with leftism. Leftism is liberal BS. Be a hardline communist. F the left. Yeah, I mean, just be a communist or Marxist. That's why I stopped calling myself a leftist a while ago, because I saw that happening. I'm like, the ruling class is going to, adopt any leftist policy it can. They're the Democratic Party, at least, and to try and co-opt young people, to get young people to stop hating capitalism. They'll portray themselves as leftists, by pretending to be against racism or whatever, while pushing right-wing neoliberal imperialist policies. Like Trevor Noah's recent talk about Russia was disgusting. But a perfect example of, Trevor Noah is considered a left-wing person in this country. He's not left-wing. He's an imperialist. He's supporting the U.S. imperial hegemony and actively doing propaganda for them. But that's what's considered left in our country. So left and right doesn't mean that much anymore. In my opinion, left means against capitalism. Right means in favor of capitalism. And there's left and right-wing communism, and that's basically what those terms should be used to describe. Left-wing communists are trying to abolish capitalism too fast and too quickly and being anti-materialist. Right-wing communists are opportunists who are siding with the bourgeoisie, siding with the imperialists or capitalists too much. Which we talked about right opportunism a lot on our last podcast or stream. Religion can be revolutionary. Absolutely. Religion goes either way. And the Sandinistas are a great example of that. There were 3 factions within the Sandinista party, and it's the more religious, more Catholic faction that has been able to win out and take power. And I see someone saying, is Islam exploitative? This is actually, I think, the best example of how religion can go either way. So there are a lot of anti-imperialist or a lot of left-wing economically Muslim people. There are a lot of people in the Muslim world who are left-wing. And this was spreading in the 50s. After World War II, there were all these anti-colonial movements, all these, sort of Muslim socialist movements, and even nationalist movements. Basically had people in the Muslim world rising up against exploitation and imperialism, which, was happening all over the world after the World War II. So there's a leaked CIA document around this time that says hope lay in the Muslim revival. And there's a whole chapter about this in Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets. And what the CIA meant by Hope Lay and the Muslim Revival was that we are going to go around the world. We're going to go into the Muslim world, especially, and support the most right-wing, terroristic, fundamentalist elements that we can. Any elements that are in favor of the U.S. and in favor of imperialism and capitalism, we're going to arm them and we're going to fund them so they can fight the left-wing Muslims, so that they can combat this sort of anti-imperialist sentiment that had been growing in the Muslim world, which of course the U.S. and the West has tried to exploit since day one of class society, especially under capitalism. So, I mean, that just shows that religion can change its form politically, right? Religion can be used as something to organize people against capitalism and imperialism. But religion was also used by the U.S. in the same situation to combat that, right? To fund groups like Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen, to create groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. These are the kind of groups who the U.S. is funded back in army. And then people don't understand, why when the U.S. leaves Afghanistan that the Taliban takes over. It's like, well, the U.S. hasn't actually been fighting extremism in the Muslim world. They've been occupying certain countries and supporting extremism. And obviously the best example of that is the state of Israel itself, and Saudi Arabia. But the U.S. has allowed extremism and terrorism to stay alive and even flourish in some cases in the Muslim world, in the Middle East. And then, we occupy Afghanistan and Iraq and kill millions of people invading those countries to fight terrorism. Like, okay, why weren't we fighting terrorism when the Soviet Union was there and we funded the Mujahideen and armed the Mujahideen and helped Osama bin Laden fight the communist Democrats, the social reformers in Afghanistan, and the Soviets? And it's because the U.S. doesn't care about social reform or bringing freedom around the world. They care about their own economic interests. And if some terrorists are going to support their interests, the U.S. will give a bunch of money and guns to those terrorists. And yes, religion can go either way. Absolutely. Are the Saudis national socialists? No. No. The Saudis are a hub of the U.S. empire who has supported and armed and funded extremist groups at the behest of the U.S. or even at their own behest, sometimes with U.S. guns and money. All over the Muslim world, they've continued their horrific war and bombing campaign in Yemen. People in the Gulf states, people in like Saudi Arabia, Dubai, the UAE, Qatar, these countries are basically like U.S. oil states, but they have certain things set up. Like in Qatar, they have a kafala system. So all of their workers, their actual workers who do the sort of hard, crappy jobs that people don't want to do, their proletariat, are migrant workers who are under these like semi-feudal, almost slave contracts that they have to sign into, where they have to work for native Qataris. And native Qataris then have these social programs, these welfare programs that only they get, that the migrants don't get. You have to have like grandparents or not grandparents. It's like your parents have to have been born in Qatar for you to get the social safety net created with the vast amount of oil wealth. So you have an incredibly unequal society there. But you have the capitalist economies there are basically a house of cards, and a middle class that's almost like a landlord class artificially created. So yeah, it's a disaster there, and definitely not anything you could call national socialism, right? Just because they have welfare programs which go towards people who are part of that nationality doesn't make it national socialism, I guess. Good question though. Shout out to Dorothy Day. Is it Dorothy? Oh, because we're talking about Catholic socialism, yeah. Thank you for the super chat. And Dorothy Day is someone you should read about in relation to Catholic socialism. I went to a Catholic college. I've never been Catholic, but the college I went to for wrestling and to study was Catholic. So there was a lot of Catholic people there. So we would do these socialist night school events where we would teach, various things about socialism to the campus. And we did a socialist night school about liberation theology and about the overlap between Catholicism and socialism, because we were socialists at a Catholic school. And we talked about Dorothy Day. So I don't remember much of it, and I'm not Catholic, so it didn't, I wasn't like, this is the best stuff ever. I'm going to read more Dorothy Day. But if you're Catholic, I would definitely recommend picking up Dorothy Day. Yeah, the Gulf states can't even reproduce their own workers, not even capitalists, just straight up neo-feudalism. Yeah, that's a good point because the workers can't, reproduce their own means of subsistence. So you don't even have like a proletariat. The proletariat is made up of these migrant workers who are trapped there under like slave contracts. And yeah, neo-feudalism is a great way to put it. Afghanistan, at least under the U.S., was a colony. It was a neo-feudal colony. And for those who don't know, one of my best buddies was deployed there. So he spent a long time there. So not only do I have the information that I've read about Afghanistan and that I've studied, which obviously I've been compelled to study it more since my buddy got deployed, but I have firsthand accounts of what's going on there. They were running the place like a neo-colony. You have like small villages outside of Kabul, which is the capital city where they have, full electricity and industrialization. Outside of that, you have a lot of small villages, and then you just have these giant U.S. military bases. And what they're finding out now, I can say this more now without, potentially getting my friend in trouble, because there's this report that's been launched by the State Department to figure out what went wrong in Afghanistan. And there was just incredible levels of corruption. Within the military, the people who were running these bases in Afghanistan that were set up for 20 years or so, there was no accountability, no responsibility. So Afghanistan is the number one place where opium comes from, and the opium that's used to make heroin, not necessarily opium that pharmaceutical companies are using. There were a lot of military bases where the people on that base were just selling it on the black market, right? And they were just getting away with this for years and years and years. And it's like, we were told that we were in Afghanistan for their freedom, not to occupy the country and have corrupt people within the U.S. military selling heroin so they can enrich themselves. But that's what Afghanistan was. That's what this report is finding out now. Then Americans are like, how did the Taliban take over? It's like, we were never fighting the Taliban or ISIS and then trying to install some stable government. That's literally what the Soviet Union was trying to do when we installed the Mujahideen, the Osama bin Laden's group that splintered into Al Qaeda. So, yeah, we've been ranting for a while. How is your boy now? Did he gain class consciousness? Hope he's in good health. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into his personal life, but he saw a lot of messed up stuff. He saw a lot of stuff that I can't even believe. So yeah, I'll be careful talking about him. I'll leave him out of this because I want to do an interview with him at some point, and I'll let him decide everything he wants to tell y'all. So, everything I learned about Afghanistan, the opium trade, first episode of Decker. I don't even know what that is. I'll have to check it out. But my buddy, I will say about my buddy who got deployed, he is on the route to class consciousness. We're getting him there. He sees why he was in Afghanistan now. I mean, he's not stupid, so he never thought he was there fighting for freedom or whatever, but he told me a lot of his people who were out there with him who did think they were fighting for freedom, and then once they kind of saw what was going on, they were like, so that was really sad to hear about. I'm done talking about that now. Many extremely important historical and current Marxist Latin Americans. Absolutely. Have you seen Philip DeFranco's TikToks? Very right-leaning in terms of geopolitics. Yeah, and I actually, one of the people who works for Phil, who makes his political videos, graduated from my college. So we message, we like DM. I always keep good relations with him. He's always worried that I'm going to like start hating him, because I do hate Philip DeFranco's content. It's terrible. It's imperialist. It's total garbage. But the person I talked to who graduated from the same politics program as me, he's fun to talk to. He's actually smart. He's a neoliberal, but he knows what's going on around the world. And he'll ask me, like, tell me about the DPRK. And I send him a big, long rant about the DPRK. And he's like, interesting, he'll throw stuff in there like it's amazing that they've been able to keep their sovereignty even though they've committed so many human rights abuses, which is like maybe the US is lying about some of those human rights abuses is what I want to tell them. But yeah, I haven't responded to any of Phil's because I don't want to get banned. My account got permanently banned after I made a video responding to Philip DeFranco about Ukraine, and basically saying he was lying about Ukraine and it's actually a U.S. proxy war. So yeah, U.S. has spent the last 20 years combating leftism in Latin America. Operation Condor, absolutely. Oh, I was just gonna jump into a reaction video, but we got another super chat. Thank you. In what way is his content garbage? Well, should we watch some quick? Since I was going to react to videos anyways. I'll just watch one of his videos on Ukraine so I can give you a specific example. Because it's the same way any neoliberal content or sort of news works. Whoops. Hush. Sorry. So he'll portray it as objective, as in I'm just giving you the news. This is what's going on in the world. My news is unbiased. It's coming from a completely unbiased place. It's like there's no such thing as unbiased news. And, DeFranco's news is absolutely not unbiased. It is 100% pushing a certain narrative. The difference, because people will say, Eddie, you're pushing a certain narrative too. Like, yeah, but I know that. I know what narrative I'm pushing. I know what my political principles are, and I can explain them to you in detail. Liberals have political principles as well. Neoliberals and imperialists have political principles as well. People who support capitalism are expressing political principles the way that Philip DeFranco does. But they portray it as unbiased because, they support the system we currently have. If I support the imperialist, capitalist, US dominated global system we already have, then I'm unbiased. Like, no, that doesn't make you unbiased. That just makes you biased in favor of the status quo. And then if you won't admit that you're biased, it also makes you a liar because every news person should know they're biased. I mean, maybe Phil says that he's biased, but, a lot of people think he's just stating straight facts here, and it's not. So let's see here. I kind of like that. I don't know which one I like better. What do y'all like better? Would you rather see me or the thing in big? Let me know in the chat. Phil DeFranco from TikTok. Yeah. Yep. That's what we're looking at. So let's see here. What's something I would disagree with? Obviously talking about the Supreme Court. What Russia plans to do in the United States this fall. All right. This is probably something I'm going to disagree with. You small, Eddie, LOL. Okay, got you. Thanks, Illinois State Fishing.
Sanctions on Russia. Currently, Russian influence operations are targeting American and Western audiences to weaken their support for providing aid to Ukraine. A new intelligence report from Homeland Security has revealed what Putin plans on doing to Americans. The Kremlin plans on influencing voters about this year's midterm.
So, I mean, right away, right? He's like, the Department of Homeland Security released this. I'm going to read it off as if it's objectively true. Everything ever that's come out of the Kremlin or Moscow or Russian media or even, anybody in the US who's not connected to Russian media, but who sounds like they're supporting Russian propaganda can be censored and is lying and is not to be trusted. But when the Department of Homeland Security publishes something out of the US State Department, who has lied us into countless wars and killed and tortured countless people abroad in order to carry out their own geopolitical and economic interests, we can take what they say verbatim, without a grain of salt at all. This is the Department of Homeland Security we're talking about. Would they lie? The Department of Homeland Security that tried to appoint a disinformation council or a disinformation director to censor anybody on social media who was posting Putin propaganda or anything that goes against the U.S. State Department's narrative. Shout out Nina Jankowicz. That's the arm of the State Department that we're supposed to put all our trust and faith in. They're just reporting the news. Of course not. We know the U.S. State Department is incredibly biased. We know that they'll make up blatant lies, and we know that they're never going to say anything that goes against their interests or release anything that goes against their interests. And right now, their interest is a proxy war with Russia. And that's what Philip DeFranco should be explaining if he was a real journalist. But because he's not, he just repeats whatever the Department of Homeland Security told him.
Influencing voters in both this year's midterms and the 2024 presidential election. Russia wanted to help amplify isolationist candidates and candidates who will reverse sanctions on Russia. Currently, Russian influence operations are targeting American and Western audiences to weaken their support for providing aid to Ukraine. And on top of this, Russia is expected to sow division in the U.S. by amplifying racial tension, with the most famous instance of this being back in 2016 when Russia created fake Facebook groups and then organized rallies of Black Lives Matter groups and pro-Trump groups in the same place. Putin is so isolated that its only hope is to create so much division in the U.S. that the U.S. feels it has to withdraw from the world in order to focus on itself.
So this video is just literally against isolationism, and it's saying anybody who's anti-imperialist, who's isolationist, who doesn't think the U.S. should be involved all over the world, according to the Department of Homeland Security, which Philip DeFranco just read off to his millions of followers as if it's an explicit fact, and as if it's not unbiased, as if the Department of Homeland Security isn't an apparatus of the U.S. empire. They stated that anybody who's supporting anti-imperialism, isolationism, the U.S. not being involved all over the world, not spending billions and billions more dollars on our military than any other country so we can keep over 1,000 military bases around the world, not spending money on doing a coup in Ukraine in 2014, which is largely what led to this conflict. Anybody who doesn't want the U.S. to do that is a right-winger like Tucker Carlson who's repeating Putin propaganda. That's the idea of the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security is one of the organizations who are leading this sort of social media crackdown, this move of our government towards autocracy and towards censorship is largely being led by the Department of Homeland Security. And we saw that with Nina Jankowicz, and the Department of Homeland Security trying to create this disinformation board to censor any Putin propaganda on social media. And then you have people like Philip DeFranco, who are conflating Putin propaganda with isolationism, saying anybody who doesn't want the U.S. to be dumping a bunch of arms and money into Ukraine and focus on ourselves instead, that's Putin propaganda. And you see how these different arms of the empire work together. You have the imperialist media saying anybody who thinks that the U.S. should be anti-imperialist and focus on ourselves is a puppet of Putin, as the Department of Homeland Security is trying to form this board to censor anybody who's a puppet of Putin. So you can just accuse anybody of being a puppet of Putin and then censor them. Volume is low on the video. Oh, sorry. I can fix that. I don't know why that happened. Oops. Let me see here. Let me fix that so that doesn't happen. Oh, I wasn't sharing the audio. Sorry. Dang it. Well, I still want to upload that to YouTube, my response to Phil DeFranco, and then I guess I'll just have to edit the video in with better audio. So you can see it if that video was confusing because the audio is shitty. I'll upload it on YouTube with better audio. All right, I was going to do another video react, but we got another super chat question from Turley Time. Thank you very much for the $2. What does mutual aid look like in your context? I think that Marxist-Leninists can and should support mutual aid whenever it leads to more education or organization of the working class or of the working masses. So mutual aid, obviously you want to go into the communities that need it the most, the communities who are struggling for food, basic needs, stuff like that, at times of economic crisis. And I think mutual aid, as we're potentially moving into like a food shortage here, mutual aid in the U.S. is going to become increasingly important as the empire starts to crumble, right? People need to know that when I can't go to the government or when I can't go to my boss, the capitalists, the people who run the country, for help, even when I can't afford food or can't get food on the table or whatever else, I can turn to the Communist Party. I can turn to the Marxist-Leninists because they're going to be organized in my community. They're going to be prepared and they're going to have food to hand out to people who need it. Right. And when people know that they can rely on the communists rather than the government or rather than the state or the capitalists, then they're going to be more inclined to listen to us. Right. And that's when you combine mutual aid with theoretical education. So mutual aid, if you're just giving people food, it's just charity then, which is mostly just a Band-Aid on the gaping wounds of capitalism. But if you're combining it with theoretical education, that's when it becomes community organizing. That's when it becomes something that's truly Marxist or organizational or revolutionary, I should say. So the best example is the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were doing these breakfast programs for kids in the inner cities in poorer neighborhoods where the Black Panthers knew that these kids didn't have food every day. They didn't get to eat breakfast in the mornings before they went to school. So the Panthers set up a table where they would, give people food, and then they would give them theoretical education. They would teach them about Marxism. They would say the reason you don't have that much food and the reason your community is poor is because of capitalism, because you're being exploited, and because of the historical legacy of racism and white supremacy in the US, and the way that white people, white capitalists in the US have used racism as a way to enforce their hegemony and exploit minority communities as much as possible. And the Panthers would explain this. And then the the FBI and the Chicago police killed Fred Hampton, who was leading this. And they burned the fourth floor of the Black Panthers headquarters, which was the part of the headquarters that had all the information about the breakfast program, all their information about the mutual aid programs and the theoretical education that they were doing, combined with feeding kids who needed food. So you could see that the capitalists, the ruling class, the State Department targeted that. They saw, and the reason they targeted it is because it was working. That shows us that mutual aid, when combined with theoretical education, works, and it's something that the State Department has to suppress. Hey everybody, what up? Comrade Noah, Eddie spitting facts, become the force people can rely on when they can't rely on the government and corporations. Absolutely. Thank you, Comrade Noah. I'll give you a flex for that one. Could not agree more. I have to run to the bathroom, and also I'm going to check my phone to see if we have anybody who wants to hop on the stream. Might have Comrade Noah on. We'll see. But I'm going to pull up a wrestling video, the same one that we were watching last time, while I leave. Because I would never want to leave you with nothing to watch, y'all. You guys need constant entertainment, right? Isn't that how Gen Z works? Hasn't TikTok trained all our minds to just only have 5-second attention spans? We can never go without dopamine and entertainment. That's how I feel sometimes. But either way, here's the video from before. This is the guy who won nationals and won the outstanding wrestler at Division III Nationals the year after we wrestled. And this was his last loss in college, actually. Ya boy. So we've already been through a lot of my senior level wrestling matches. The wrestling I do now, but now we're digging into the old college archives. So this is one of my best matches my senior year of college. Like I said, this kid's a beast. All right, I'll be right back, comrades. How am I doing? Am I winning? Comrade Noah is celebrating Father's Day right now, so I don't know if we'll have him on right now. But maybe later on. I forgot to plug in one of my lights, y'all. Do I look dark? I got all these darn ring lights. Basically bought the dollar store out of stock. Now I don't even have one in. Actually, most of my ring lights, I have 3. Most of them came from my wonderful sister as Christmas gifts. So, based sister moment, am I right? Am I right or am I right? What's on Suriano? Nick Suriano? He's a beast of a wrestler. Why do anarchists and tankies hate each other? I thought they were both communists. I wouldn't consider an anarchist a communist. It's a different thing, but basically it's the same end goal. A stateless, classless society is what communists and anarchists want. Anarchists usually just want to jump right to it. They're like, we need to have a revolution and establish a socialist society that's nothing like the USSR or China. It's just decentralized immediately. And so like anarchism has changed over the years, and there are so many different strands of anarchism now. Not all of them believe this, what I'm saying. This is like a generalization because anarchists will be like, that's not what I think. You're straw manning me, which it's not what all of them think. But basically, they don't want this transitionary socialist state. They don't want dictatorship of the proletariat where the working class seizes control of the government, the state apparatus, and uses it to transition into socialism. Anarchists usually don't believe in that. They think the dictatorship of the proletariat in existing socialist countries has been authoritarian and repressive, and because of that, we shouldn't do it anymore. I think that's silly. I think the idea that you're going to tell people, socialism's never tried socialism's never worked every time it's been tried, but just let me try it. We'll do it the right way this time. That doesn't make any sense. Nobody's going to get on board with that, and it's not historically accurate. The socialist countries who have maintained worker control of the state apparatus and have used the state apparatus to build socialism, to bring about economic construction, and to defend against imperialism, those are the socialist states who have done the best. Those are the socialist states who have abolished illiteracy, massively increased life expectancy. In China now, the retirement age for women is 55 and for men it's 60. And that's continually on the decline. All these successes of socialism, which I don't need to go into, y'all know about those. Anarchists don't defend those. So yeah, and which aids imperialism, which largely I think anarchism is historically and currently an individualistic or sometimes imperialist and opportunist ideology compared to communism and socialism. But again, as I was talking about at the beginning of the stream with Jimmy Dore, there are a lot of anarchists who are politically active. There are a lot of anarchists who will do mutual aid with you. You're going to have to work with anarchists if you work politically in America right now. If you're doing actual work, you're just going to run into anarchist people and you're going to interact with them and work together. It's just how it is. The politically active radicals in the U.S. right now, they're communists and socialists and anarchists. So you got to work together. And if you can work together, right, if they're saying, I'll do mutual aid with you and help you do mutual aid and we can teach people Marx, yeah, like why not go ahead and do that with an anarchist? Obviously, you're going to have a different interpretation of Marx. But you're still, working together to feed people and get people organized to do community organizing. So there's certain times when you have to ally with certain people, and that's why like cancel culture is anti-Marxist, because it makes making those alliances freaking impossible if you cancel somebody every time they have something you don't like or say something you disagree with. Thanks for book recommendation. Thank you. Idealism is a problem. Absolutely. All right, let's see here. I want to watch this first. All right, so let's react to this. Do y'all know who Max Boot is? Max Boot is a member of the American political establishment. He was one of the main people who who supported the Iraq War, helped justify the Iraq War, helped lie the American public into supporting the Iraq War. But of course, because in capitalism, doing good work or doing hard work doesn't actually get you to the top. Having connections and being a tool of the American State Department is what gets you, advances you in your career. Max Boot is still around, even though he lied us into the Iraq War and he should be in jail somewhere. He's still around, still spreading imperialist propaganda. But now he's no longer a conservative. He's disavowed the conservatives and he's become a Democrat. Good old Liz Cheney move. So I guess Liz Cheney and Max Boot, all these people who supported the Iraq War, the crime of the century, now, because they've confessed their sins and become liberal Democrats and are now pushing for war on the for the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party, the establishment is calling them great people and they're reformed and they're changed. And Liz Cheney should run for president. We should all vote for her because she's no longer a conservative, because she doesn't like Trump. That was the main thing. Liz Cheney and Max Boot didn't like Trump, so they switched to the Democratic Party, which, Trump was saying anti-imperialist stuff. In one of Trump's last days in office, he tried to withdraw U.S. troops from like every intervention and the Pentagon blocked it. So, even though Trump's not a real anti-imperialist or not a real representative of the American masses, some of the things he said were representative of the American masses in the way that they feel about the political establishment. He wanted to withdraw troops from a lot of the U.S. interventions. So for people like Max Boot and Liz Cheney, who are connected to the weapons contractors, the military industrial complex, the companies who make money off of war and lobby the politicians and control the media in order to tell lies in favor of war, they saw the Republican Party going a little bit anti-imperialist. And they're like, oh, we better jump ship. Look, the Democrats, they always support war. There's no chance, look what they did to Bernie. There's no chance of somebody who's anti-war winning the Democratic nomination. That's the party for us. And now we have the Democratic and liberal Max Boot and Liz Cheney, and MSNBC and CNN is just propping them up as if they're the best thing since sliced bread because they don't like Trump. And it's horrible to watch. So this was a great little segment here from Jimmy talking about Max Boot, who appeared on MSNBC to spread his pro-war propaganda about Ukraine. Let me know how the volume is in the chat, please.
So now we just did a story. We just showed you that the mainstream news and even the unmainstream news doesn't invite people like me on to debunk, or people like Glenn Greenwald to debunk stuff like Russiagate or Syria, or now, or to talk about the truckers in Canada, or to talk about Ukraine. But these are the types of people who are invited on to talk about Ukraine. So if you're pro-war, you'll always have a spot in corporate media. So this guy's name is Max Boot. And who is he? He's a fellow over at the, what CFR stands for, Center, I don't know.
Speed this up just a bit.
Relations, is it? Center for, what's the CFR? Look that up.
The Council on Foreign Relations.
That's it, Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, Kurt. So he's a fellow over at the Council on Foreign Relations, and now you know to be always suspicious, skeptical, and critical of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he writes for the Post Opinions, an editorial writer. So this is the kind of stuff that is allowed on MSNBC. Now, I couldn't go on. They're not going to have Jackson Hinkle on to debunk all their garbage about Ukraine. They're not going to have me on tell you what Zelensky's really doing about the Nazis in Ukraine. But they will bring on this guy, Max Boot, to say this.
It's absolutely essential. And I think the key here is we have to understand that we're making a mistake in the way that we think about the war, because we keep thinking about it as their war. the Ukrainians are fighting. We need to think about it as our war. Putin is waging war on the West. He is trying to destroy the rules-based international order that we Americans.
Putin is.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, like, obviously we're used to these people being liars and, and sometimes saying the quiet part out loud, but he's just like, this isn't Ukraine's war. This is the US's war versus Russia. Like, yeah, that's what we've been saying. That's what I got banned on TikTok for saying. That this is a U.S. proxy war against Russia that they've been waging for years because Russia doesn't go along with the U.S.'s global interests. Or at least they haven't under Putin. And Max Boot is like, this isn't Ukraine's war with Russia. This is the U.S.'s war. And we need to fight Russia because they don't go along with the international rules-based order that was set up by the U.S. and their allies after World War II in order to give the U.S. total imperial hegemonic dominance of the world. That's what he means by the rules-based order. U.S. hegemony, pretending every country the U.S. attacks is an authoritarian dictatorship while pretending the U.S. An oligarchy which is entirely controlled by the ruling corporate class, pretending that is a democracy as we continue to launch undemocratic wars all around the world. In pursuit of the economic interests of the small class of people who controls our government. That's what he means by the international rules-based order, and that's what Russia's challenging. And he's just saying, like, yeah, we need to support a proxy war in Ukraine to fight Russia because they're coming after our interests. It's like, do we? I never voted to send $52 billion to Ukraine, and more and more people are opening their eyes to this, and more people are tying U.S. Militarism and U.S. imperialism to the economic destitution and economic hardships that we're seeing at home. So I saw earlier Louis Logic, a wonderful comrade of ours, was saying that he's been working at a gas station and class consciousness is increasing. It absolutely is. People are, looking at the gas prices and they're questioning what Joe Biden is doing in Ukraine. They're looking at the gas prices and they're saying, why is gas this high when the Biden administration just sent $52 billion in weapons and money to Ukraine? And they're admitting that it's to fight a war against Russia. I don't have any interest in fighting a war against Russia. I want that money to be reinvested in Americans and making it so I can afford gas to go to work, and I can afford to put food on the table. And this is going to increasingly happen as imperialism crumbles, because imperialism is the stage of capitalism that we're in, and it's unsustainable and it's contradictory. So as U.S. imperial domination ends, it's going to increasingly hurt the people at home and the working masses at home. China recently published, some Chinese media outlet published, it was the Statue of Liberty. It was like a political cartoon. And the Statue of Liberty was throwing a brick at another country, but they were pulling the brick out of their own base. So the Statue of Liberty is grabbing a brick out of itself and then throwing it at another country. That is U.S. imperialism. And we've been throwing bricks at other countries and pulling them out of ourselves for the last 70 years. And now our country is deindustrialized largely. We're completely run by a financial oligarchy of banking capitalists who bail themselves out anytime their artificial economy collapses. And, we regular Americans can't afford baby food. We're having a shortage of baby food. And the response of our government is to dump millions and millions and millions of dollars into Ukraine, to fund a proxy war against Russia. When we helped create this proxy war, largely created this proxy war by doing a coup in Ukraine in 2014 and funneling even more and more and more and more and more money into the most right-wing extremist pro-U.S. groups in the region. As our people are hungry and experiencing shortages. So this is only going to increasingly happen. And it's like we have an option as Americans, right? We can either allow our country to collapse and devolve into like fighting and civil war and allow these right-wing groups to take over. Or we can get serious as communists and socialists. We can organize ourselves theoretically. We can organize ourselves in order to do self-defense against the groups who might take power as the American empire collapses. And we can really turn this country into something revolutionary, into something based on construction rather than imperialist destruction. We can sublate it, the negation of the negation, negate our negative aspects while keeping the economic construction and the good aspects of the current country. So yeah, great comment there from Louis Logics. Check your text, brother. Okay, I will check my text after we finish this video, and then you can hop on if you're still down. All right, let's continue with this video.
We Americans.
Putin is trying to destroy the rules-based international order. You know, the rule that says if you're bigger than everyone else, you can invade the country and steal their natural resources, kill 1 million people, and nothing bad will happen to you. Like what we did in Libya, like what we did in Iraq, like what we did in, right now we're occupying a third of Syria. Which third? The oil fields. Like what we're doing in Ethiopia, like what we're doing in Yemen, like what we're doing in Somalia. You mean like that? You mean those kind of rules-based order?
Why does he say we need to start thinking about it as our war if everybody's got Ukraine flags and all this stuff and we send him $40 billion, $50 billion?
Because he sees it waning. He sees people's enthusiasm for the war waning. And
I've noticed that too. I've noticed people's enthusiasm is waning. Like Louis was talking about, class consciousness is increasing. Yes, and skepticism about the U.S. empire is increasing. Because obviously I got the TikTok banned when I immediately came out and said, the U.S. has largely created this conflict. And I was saying Russia isn't going to invade Ukraine to take them over. Russia is going to, do a special military operation in eastern Ukraine, and the U.S. is going to portray it as the worst invasion ever. And, I don't care whether you call it a special military operation or an invasion or whatever. The point is that the U.S. empire has been waging a proxy war against Russia, and they've largely have been the ones who brought us into this situation. And more people have figured that out. More and more people have been listening to learning about the history of Ukraine and looking at what the U.S. State Department has actually been doing in Ukraine over the past 20 years. And they're realizing that the U.S. has constantly been pushing us closer towards a war, constantly been provoking Russia and moving more and making Ukraine a country that's hostile towards Russia politically, and arming and backing groups who were attacking Russian speakers within Ukraine and being hostile towards Russia as a country, up to the point where Russia felt like they needed to invade Ukraine and get rid of these U.S.-backed groups in order to protect their own national security. And more and more people are realizing that, like, folks like Max Boot have been lying about this, lying when they say that Russia just invaded for no reason, that Putin's just this irrational person who hates Ukrainians, and he just invaded because he wants to return to the Russian Empire. Like, that's not true. And as time goes by, people are increasingly finding the truth. And I'm noticing, at first when I would do videos about Ukraine, and this was when we had more followers on our TikTok account, but there would be thousands of people in the comments. This is when we got banned. Thousands of people in the comments calling me a Russian propagandist, a Putin puppet, and a supporter of fascism because I wasn't supporting the Ukrainian neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I guess that's what it means to support fascism to a liberal. But there's less of that now. The arguments that I see made in favor of the U.S., doing a proxy war in Ukraine now I'm seeing less of it, and the ideas are increasingly easier to debunk. Like, the people are just saying blatant propaganda points, saying that the U.S. did a coup in Ukraine in 2014 is Putin propaganda. It's like, no, it's not. The U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Victoria Nuland, admitted that the U.S. funneled millions and millions of dollars into Ukrainian U.S.-backed NGOs in order to do a coup. The U.S. literally admitted it. So you can call that Putin propaganda if you want. It's not. And more people are opening their eyes to this. More and more people who had Ukraine flags in their bio are realizing that they're basically supporting U.S. armed neo-Nazis. And they've taken a more nuanced perspective on the war, on the conflict. So hopefully that continues to happen. And hopefully more and more people see through these folks like Max Boot. The same freaking people who lied us into Iraq. The same people who lied us into the Iraq war, the Cheneys and the Max Boots of the world, are now on MSNBC telling us that we need to funnel all our money and weapons and resources into fighting a war with Russia. Like, I think it's about time we stop listening to these motherfuckers.
Now he's paid to come and get people to get emotionally invested again. There's more to this.
So it means we need to start again thinking about it like our war.
Yeah.
We fell off from how we already thought about it.
We all stand for this. This is a direct threat to all of us, and we need to understand this is not a foreign aid project. This is not charity. This is self-defense. This is the front line of freedom right here in the Donbass. The Ukrainians are fighting and dying for all of us. We need to step up and to echo what.
So this is a
This is nuts. This is nuts. He's one admitting how important that this proxy war is to the U.S., that this is the front, of the U.S. empire's battle with Russia and China. Ukraine is the front right now. So he's admitting that the U.S. is doing a proxy war. And then he says the Ukrainians are fighting this battle for us, but we need to support them more. We need to encourage them to keep fighting by putting Ukraine flags in our bio. We need to encourage them to fight till the end. Send them more weapons. You're just encouraging using Ukrainians as cannon fodder. You're literally admitting here, Max Boot, that you want to use Ukrainians as cannon fodder in order to support the interests and the dominance globally of the U.S. empire. You're admitting that this is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, and then you're saying that Ukrainians are fighting it for us, and we're not supporting them enough, encouraging them to keep fighting. It's so obvious that this is a propagandist for the U.S. State Department who hates Russia because they challenge the U.S. economically and politically. And now he's willing to force Ukraine to fight down to the last Ukrainian. There's no end to the number of Ukrainians who these people like Max Boot and the weapons contractors who fund him and write his checks. There's no limit to the number of Ukrainians that they will encourage to be killed, in order to threaten Russia, in order to continue this proxy war with Russia. Why is he not calling for peace? Why is he not talking about peace? If he cares so deeply about the Ukrainians, why is he saying that this is a battle between the U.S. and Russia, not Ukraine and Russia, and Ukraine's fighting it for us, and they need to keep going? If this isn't Ukraine's battle, if this is the U.S. versus Russia, the answer isn't to funnel a bunch of arms into the most extremist neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine who are going to keep the fighting going and to encourage them to keep fighting down to the last Ukrainian. The solution is peace, to get the Ukrainian people out of this conflict, to have them stop fighting a war with Russia that's really a war between the U.S. and Russia, and that the U.S. has destabilized the politics in Ukraine for the last 7 years in order to wage. It's not the Ukrainians' fight. Max Boot's right about that. But the people who are making it the Ukrainians' fight, the people who for the last 7 years have been encouraging the Ukrainians to take up arms and fight this fight on the behest of the U.S., at the behest of the U.S., is the U.S. State Department. Is these people who funneled tons and tons of money into Ukrainian U.S.-backed NGOs prior to 2017 in order to put in power a president who made Stefan Bandera, the neo-Nazi, or the former Nazi, who the neo-Nazis idolize, made him a national hero. That was what the U.S.-backed administration did. So it is a proxy war. Max Boot's right, but it's a proxy war that the U.S. has been shoving Ukraine into with a gun to their head, or even going in and destabilizing their politics themselves when Ukrainian politics aren't going the way that the U.S. wants, in order to wage a war against Russia. And Max Boot is like, this is all okay, this is all good, and this is why we need to support the Ukrainians more. You're a moron, Max. You are a liar and a moron.
So this is what he's saying, is we are at war with a nuclear power. That's what he's trying to convince you of, that we're not at war yet, but he wants you to think we are. And he wants you to think that Russia is somehow threatening us. They're not. You know who's threatening us? Joe Biden's administration is threatening our livelihoods. Not Putin, Joe Biden. And he's not going to tell you that because he's an establishment. Now, a lot of people call him a neocon right-winger, but he's in line perfectly with the Democratic Party.
Was saying it is unacceptable that right now the Ukrainians are being outgunned 10-1 in artillery, 10-1. They are losing over 100 soldiers a day. The United States has not seen those kinds of losses since World War II. The Ukrainians are willing to fight. They are willing to die. They are defending their land. They are standing up to one of the most evil dictators in the world, but they don't have the weapons they need to get the job done.
I mean, this is evil. This is evil. He just admitted that Ukraine's a proxy war being led by the U.S. against Russia. This man who works for the weapons contractors, the people who make money off of war by selling 95% of what they produce to the U.S. government, to the U.S. State Department. He just admitted that U.S. government is doing a proxy war and is using Ukraine. Then he says, but they're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, to fight and die to the last Ukrainian to defend their land. They're not even defending their land, really. They would have a lot, but there's a chance that they're going to lose a chunk of their land outside of just the Donbass region when this conflict is all said and done with, that Ukraine wouldn't have lost if they would have entered a peace agreement, if they would have signed the Minsk agreement, which the U.S. State Department told them not to sign because the U.S. State Department doesn't actually want peace. They've always wanted this war with Russia. They've wanted to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. So Max Boot lies about that and says Ukraine is fighting, or lies by omission about that, and then says Ukraine is willing to fight to the last person to defend their land. You just said the war is not about their land. You just said the war is a war between the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. is waging a proxy war. But now the fights over Ukrainian land, the land in the Donbass, where U.S.-backed neo-Nazis have been shelling and killing Russian speakers for the past 7 years, that Russia refused to acknowledge and give independence to for 7 years, despite those places in eastern Ukraine asking for it. You can explain that situation away as simply as this is just Ukraine defending their land, and they're willing to fight to the last man, and that's why we need to send them more weapons. Why are you the one, Max Boot, you puppet of the State Department and the military-industrial complex? Why are you the one telling us that Ukrainians are willing to fight to the last man? Let's hear from some Ukrainian civilians. Are they really, really, really willing to fight and die, lose every single member of their family in this war, when propagandists are literally admitting it's a U.S. proxy war, right? Because I know that you want the war to keep going. You're a puppet of the military-industrial complex in the U.S. State Department. And you just admitted that this is a U.S. proxy war against Russia. So, yeah, clearly you want Ukrainians to fight down to the last man. But what about them? Why are we never hearing from them? Why is it always these stooges of the military-industrial complex who are giving us the news? Disgusting. God, if there's any afterlife, Max Boot is going to the bad place.
Have just enough to prevent a Russian victory, but they don't have enough to defeat the Russians, to win for Ukraine.
And the reason why they don't have enough weapons to defeat Russia is because they are never going to defeat Russia. And so him saying that if we just gave them enough weapons, they could defeat Russia. They are never going to defeat Russia, ever. And everyone knows that. And he knows it too, but he's what they call a paid liar. He sounds like a used weapons car salesman.
Yes.
Here we go.
That is unacceptable. All of us need to step up. The Europeans in particular, as Joe suggested, because they are doing less than we are. But we need to step up too. We're not providing Gray Eagle drones.
Europe is right next to Russia. Europe is right next to Russia. That's where they get all their gas. They have economic ties to Russia more so than the U.S. And, we think about all the economic hardships and gas that increasing gas prices and inflation that we're experiencing in the U.S., partially as a product of this conflict. Imagine in Europe. And the U.S. is asking European countries who get like 55% of their energy from Russia to just stop getting energy from Russia. And that's why you have the U.S. now begging Venezuela for their oil after the U.S. has held them under sanctions. So this is empire in collapse. And this is the U.S. Max Boot here getting angry that European countries, even though European countries and NATO countries have, largely played a role in this conflict and have, been imperialists and have supported the U.S., they haven't gone as far as the U.S. has wanted. And people like Max Boot are angry about it. Our European allies need to do more. I'm sure Europe, most people in Europe just don't want World War III, right? And they understand that they're being used as U.S. proxies because that's what European countries always have been used like. But it's not the same situation for them. But the military-industrial complex gets mad that they can't run the whole world like a chessboard. Like, oh, we can't move Germany to A3. Why won't Germany use all of their money to send all their weapons into Ukraine? Like, maybe the German people have interests outside of U.S. proxy wars against Russia, Max. Holy shit.
that the Ukrainians need. We're not providing as many multiple launch rocket systems as they need. All of us collectively can be and should be doing more because we need to understand this is our fight that the Ukrainians are on the front lines of.
Nick Cruz says, you're just a weapon salesman. Advocate for peace, you psychopath. So he's advocating giving more arms to the
So can the
to
U.S.
these people,
deliver?
which are the Nazis in Ukraine.
Nazis are our only hope, Jimmy.
That's right. Literal. I'm not making that up. And this guy tweets out, wait a second, I've seen this before. And of course, before we got in bed with who? This is the Mujahideen. These turned out to be Osama bin.
Yeah, Rambo 3. Rambo gave that kid his knife, and the kid grew up and hijacked a plane.
That's anti-Soviet.
We talked about that earlier today, and it is the same thing. You know, the Azov Battalion, and IDAR, and these other extremist groups who are being backed in Ukraine. You know, people aren't thinking about it the same way as the U.S., you know, funneling money into terrorist groups in the Muslim world, funneling money and arms into the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden. Because, you know, people think of those groups as terrorists, you know, because they're Muslim, they're terrorists. But, you know, the Azov Battalion and IDAR, that's different. They're fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty and fighting for freedom. No, they're neo-Nazi groups who have been killing people in the Donbass and killing children in the Donbass for years, ever since the U.S. basically gave them amnesty to do so by backing a coup in Ukraine in 2014. And now the U.S. has given tons of arms and funding to these extremist right-wing groups, these neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, the same way they gave arms and funding to right-wing extremist groups in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And you have groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these groups running around with U.S. weapons now. The U.S. is doing the same thing in Europe, and this will have lasting effects too. Someone says the U.S. dumped a bunch of arms into there the same way they did with Syria. Yeah, and Syria still has this giant black market of weapons, right? And there have been all sorts of groups have been able to get their hands on weapons because of all the weapons that the U.S. dumped into this region without really worrying about who's even going to get them. That's exactly what they've done here in Ukraine. And there are definitely going to be lasting effects of that. Yeah, great. Jimmy's analysis there was pretty good. That was an unbelievable video. Crazy that how much these weapons contractors like Max Boot, these propagandists for the Raytheon and Boeing and them, crazy how blatantly they will lie on behest of the State Department. Cabatox, the link that you sent me, I've got it pulled up. We're going to watch it in a sec. Thank you. But let me see here. I can't believe we live in a universe where weapons contractors are constantly getting into positions of power. Yeah, it's crazy. The military-industrial complex, folks. Here's one that I wanted to read. Raytheon is one of the biggest hirers at public universities in Massachusetts. Interesting connection between U.S. academia and imperialism there in the military-industrial complex. But this person says, and like clockwork, right after Russia invaded, my university was emailing me to come to pro-Ukraine conferences. Yep. And the public universities in Wisconsin were the same. Iowa's a little different because a lot of the non-state schools, a lot of the non-Division I colleges are private, so they can kind of make their own decisions. But in Wisconsin, they're all under a UW state system, it's called. So I can't talk about it too much, but basically, you know, pro-Ukraine stuff was coming out the day after the invasion. I imagine it's because the universities in Wisconsin are tied to the government, and they have to follow certain rules and regulations, which are systematized across the state. So I'm sure an order came down through the state system to say, you know, make sure all the higher learning institutions are telling those college students to support Ukraine and put Ukraine flags in their bio. Yeah, interesting there. So before we look at this link that someone in the chat sent, we have Max Boot is very sorry for backing the GOP and the Iraq invasion. Why is he being praised for this? So Max Boot published a whole book called The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. And he talked about how evil the conservatives are now, and the Democrats and the liberals are the only ones we can trust. Because the Democrats and the liberals will let me go on MSNBC and do propaganda in favor of the military-industrial complex and lie the American public into a proxy war with Ukraine. And tell the American public that we're sorry, we can't do anything about high gas prices. We have to send billions of dollars in weapons to neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. Because trust us, it's the right thing to do. That's what the Democratic Party is. That's what the liberals are. And that's where people like Max Boot and Liz Cheney have found their home. The Democratic Party, the liberal establishment, is the home of people who can make a bunch of money being paid by weapons contractors to lie the American public into war. So anyone who thinks the Democrats are any better than the Republicans at this point, I have a bridge to sell you. So here's something. I don't know what this is exactly, but someone in the chat sent it, said it was related, and they said I'm going to love it. So we'll check this out as well. Is kind of an add-on to our response to that Jimmy Dore Ukraine video. Ooh, and then we got a super chat. I will get to that ASAP.
Deliver the heavy weapons. The U.S. has contributed, I think, nearly $2 billion in aid, militarily, economic, since this war began. Can the U.S. be doing more?
The most important thing right now is the weapon systems, the weapons they need. They need to have Stingers and the Javelins, but they also need anti-aircraft capabilities. They need anti-missile capabilities. They need anti-tank capabilities. There's a lot of weapon systems, the weapons they need. We have to bring these weapons to get the weapons to the Ukrainians, move these weapon systems, to deliver those weapon systems, make sure that the Ukrainians are getting the weapons with anti-missile capabilities, Patriot missiles, the S-300s, the S-400s, weapon systems, additional aircraft, as many weapons as necessary to provide weapons, sophisticated weapons, whatever possible weapons can be provided.
Undisclosed conflict of interest. He works at a firm whose clients include Raytheon, the second largest military contractors in the world.
The most important thing right now is the weapons.
We should arm the Ukrainians, providing weapons, providing supplies, defenses to arm with weapons, with ammunition. We have to simply do more, to do something more. To do more, we will have to do more. More direct involvement of some kind will be inevitable. More arms, more and more pressure for us to do more and more by way of supplying weapons, arms.
Undisclosed conflict of interest. He's on the board of directors at Lockheed Martin, the largest military contractor in the world.
Arm the Ukrainians, anti-tank, get them armed drones. We need to make sure that we get them air defense systems and ammunition, lots of ammunition. Whatever we can get them, we're going to have to continue to arm the Ukrainians.
Undisclosed conflict of interest. She's the chair of the BAE Systems board of directors.
By the way, I've been always for us to update and modernize our nuclear arsenal. That's important.
We need to continue to flow the weapons, any missiles, anything they ask for. We need to get the weapons systems, heavy weapons. We got to be giving them anti-ship missiles, combat jets, good fighters, ammo, howitzers, plenty of fire.
I'm almost speechless. I mean, that video speaks for itself. Does it not? I mean, what an incredible compilation of these weapons contracting propagandist ghouls on media. Oh, it's Matt Orf. Let's go. I don't know why I'm not subscribed to Matt Orfalea yet. Everyone follow this guy. He makes great leftist content. Compilations like this. He's a really, really skilled editor, and he makes probably the best, most well-produced and well-edited anti-imperialist socialist content. But it's insane. Yeah. And there's a change in the Marxist analysis of imperialism that needs to come about with the military-industrial complex. So the military-industrial complex arises, post World War II or during World War II even. And even President Eisenhower was warning about it and warning how it was increasing its power and increasing its control over the U.S. government and the U.S. State Department. So before that, imperialism, one, there hadn't been a hegemonic dominant world power the same way that the U.S. became after World War II. So in Lenin's 1917 classic, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he's looking at inter-imperialist rivalries, and he's looking at these financial capitalists who own the governments, who are basically encouraging the governments to do wars for expansion, and then they're exporting capital. So they're setting up ways to, extract resources or whatever else, sending certain kinds of means of production to these countries. So that they can exploit these countries and making sure that these countries give us extremely cheap labor and extremely cheap access to resources. And this is how transnational corporations have extracted, so much wealth out of Africa and Latin America, which has been funneled into the Western world and used to develop us rather than, a system of mutual development around the world. So imperialism was largely driven at that point by the syndicates, the trusts, the cartels, banks, or what we think of as like corporate conglomerates, like banks merging with industrial capital. So just bankers and regular manufacturing capitalists basically are merging together and using the government to do imperialism, where they export capital and then control these countries. Once the military industrial complex comes along, so after imperialism has been going on for a long time, and you have these companies who get extremely powerful, like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, companies who sell weapons, those companies start lobbying the government in favor of war, in favor of interventionism, just to make money selling weapons. So you have the creation within, the development of capitalist imperialism of a block, a conglomerate of capitalists, which we call the military industrial complex, who will lobby the government just to do war. War itself is the goal. The goal is not even necessarily controlling more territory and controlling markets and controlling labor and controlling political systems. The idea is just to do war and to sell a bunch of weapons so these companies can make a lot of money selling weapons. So, not anymore is it only these bankers and industrial capitalists, these conglomerates, trusts, and syndicates who are doing imperialism and using the government as a tool of imperialism. It's the military industrial complex. It's these companies who make money off of war itself. And now, in Afghanistan and Iraq, like on the U.S. military bases, I mean, Afghanistan, not anymore, but on the U.S. military bases, they had like Starbucks, and you could buy like Apple products. So you have all these companies who then tied themselves to the military industrial complex. There's a really good book about this called The Complex by Nick Terse. All these regular consumer companies like Starbucks tied themselves to the military industrial complex, and now they're making money off of war. Because if you start a war and occupy a country and set up a bunch of U.S. military bases, which there are over 1,000 around the world, you can also build a Starbucks on that base, and you can make Starbucks some money. And you can make Howard Schultz some money, who ran for president as a Democrat last year, the owner of Starbucks. So, the military-industrial complex as a force for controlling our government and as a force for encouraging imperialist actions and imperialist wars and imperialist proxy wars abroad is something that emerged after Lenin and something that needs to be added to his analysis of capitalist imperialism. Are liberals basically recycling the bourgeois revolution in order to overcome the right? I think so. I think, but the Democrats are going to get destroyed in the next elections. I don't know what's happening. But that's a good way to kind of describe it. They're kind of going back to the principles of liberalism and liberal democracy and saying these principles are being threatened. We need to reestablish these principles of liberal democracy, which actually aren't principles of democracy. But they're not recycling it. It's different now. It's the negation of the negation. It's been sublated. So they're still arguing for like cracking down on freedom of speech in order to protect democracy, which is not, something that would have been argued during the American bourgeois revolution or liberal enlightenment. It's specifically what I think is happening is the conservatives, the Republicans, a lot of their voter base, not the Republican politicians, not neocons or whatever, but the voting base of Republicans is becoming more anti-imperialist. Tucker Carlson's talking about Ukraine, people's gas prices are going up, and they're like, I don't like this, and it's easy for me to blame it on Biden, so now I'm going to be anti-imperialist, and Biden is the reason the gas prices are high, and Biden's doing this war in Ukraine, blame Biden. So the Democratic Party is responding to that by sort of acting like anybody who's anti-imperialist, anybody who criticizes Biden's policy in Ukraine, or the high gas prices under the Biden administration. Anybody who's criticizing that is either a Putin puppet or just an irrational, crazy right-wing Trump supporter, a neo-fascist or whatever. So I think the liberal Democratic Party is tying their enemies together, or trying to tie their enemies together and then just censor them all and shut them all up. So they're saying, any conservative or any anti-imperialist criticizing the U.S. efforts in Ukraine and all the money funneled into Ukraine, Those anti-imperialists are the same as the conservative people criticizing Biden for Ukraine and the gas prices, and they all should be censored by the Department of Homeland Security. That's what I think the Democratic strategy is right now, while also co-opting left-wing sort of identity politics issues and pretending that they care about social issues, right? Pretending like they care about Roe v. Wade when it gets repealed, when the Democrats could have codified Roe v. Wade into law for years, or they could have pushed harder for Roe v. Wade to become an established law for years. But they didn't, because they don't actually care about it. They care about mobilizing people around them. I mean, honestly, the repeal of Roe v. Wade is like a gift to the Democrats, because now the Democrats can, their voting base is going to be mobilized. They're going to be more paying attention to politics. The Democrats are going to say, you need to vote for us. You need to vote for us, see? Otherwise, they'll take away your civil rights. It's like, wait, aren't you guys in power right now? And they still took away my civil rights. So I don't know how much that Democratic strategy is going to work. I don't know how effective it's going to be, but that's what I see them doing. Oh, shoot, I got to check Discord. Noah, you still here, comrade? You still trying to hop in? I'm sorry, I kind of spaced. I got way too into that last segment. Just put it in the chat if you're still here. I have some more videos to react to. You can react to them with me. All right, I'll just send you the link to StreamYard, Noah, and then you can hop in if you want. Or not. Totally up to you. All right, let's watch Jacob CT's TikTok. He shared that forever and a half ago. So we should watch this next.
Anti-communist propaganda film, and I'm going to watch it. I'm going to subject myself to capitalist dogma.
One day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Already they're making communists out to be comic book villains.
Courses here in this strangest of all schools. Espionage as a science.
What the fuck?
Baseball game. Hot dogs.
Oh no, not the hot dogs. Freedom and You. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Defense.
You remember that Russian town we saw earlier?
Oh, you mean that Russian town where everyone speaks English? Now, it wouldn't be the 50s if we weren't clearly shown that the husband and wife sleep in two separate beds.
I don't think you were allowed to put on TV the wife and husband in the same bed. I'm pretty sure that like in the 60s or 70s was the first time you were allowed to do that, or the first time a TV show did it. And it was like groundbreaking. This is interesting. And I just want to say, like, it says, on this video, this is brought to you by the Department of Defense. So basically announcing that it's imperialist propaganda. But with Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin and these weapons contractors who make up the military industrial complex, they'll still do that, right? You'll see media that's produced and it'll be like brought to you by Raytheon, or like, maybe not brought to you by Raytheon, but like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. They'll have their logo plastered on whatever it is they're trying to promote. I was at a wrestling tournament the other day. I put it on TikTok on my old account, the one that got banned, but it was like, thank you for our great sponsors, Raytheon. And I was like, these people are everywhere. The military industrial complex controls everything in our country. And it's a good way to tell if something's propaganda or not. If you can spot the military industrial complex, whether they have their logo slapped on there or not. With the rainbow motif, of course, says R.I.P. Shireen Abu Akleh. Yes, of course. They have to also co-opt identity politics.
They would give. Come on, comrade.
Oh yeah, because every single one of us communists refer to each other as comrade.
You are now prepared for the next step of your indoctrination.
What? Am I just watching a comic book story come to life?
Yes. My favorite professor in college, who studied in China and was a Marxist, had this presentation he would give, a very good presentation, about how the Marvel movies were basically propaganda for U.S. imperialism, or the same narrative behind all the Marvel movies is the same narrative that the U.S. empire gives for invading everyone. So literally a comic book narrative. You know, there's this evil guy doing evil things. And, you know, once we take out that evil guy, the evil things will stop. So, you know, we need to send heroes, the good guys, Captain America, and they'll take out the bad guys, and that will save people's lives, you know, just like Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So it's this overly simplistic good guy, bad guy, black and white narrative that Hollywood just beats us over the head with as they're being funded by the Department of Defense and military industrial complex actors. Yeah, they beat us over the head with that black and white sort of, you know, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys narrative, even in our media. And people believe the world really works like that, right? They believe there's a country where all the people, their leaders are just like, time for your indoctrination. And the people are like, yes, you know, we are communists. Yes, indoctrinate us. Yes, please. Beep, boop. I am communist robot. Tell me what to do. I hate freedom. Doop, doop, doop. Like, what people in the world anywhere would hear, now time for your indoctrination? Be like, yeah, let's follow that guy. That's not how the world works. If the DPRK or China or whoever else were as authoritarian as the US accuses them of being, those places would have had a revolution a long time ago. The people would have overthrown those authoritarian governments. But our media and our propaganda portrays the world like a comic book. So Americans will, you know, State Department hopes that Americans will see the real world like a comic book.
Serving the children. Their meals that be consumed without interruption.
We learned in school that home life does not encourage the growth of the collective character which the party wishes to develop in its young people.
What kids talk like this? They literally look like that they're reading off of cue cards.
You better listen to me. All of you. I don't want to hear any more talk about state schools, party lines, and collective character, deviationism.
Yeah, no freedom of thought and expression.
You two are going to Sunday school, you're going right now.
You're going to be indoctrinated into the church and you're going to love it.
Everything on this table is as phony as the town. The rotten system you call communism. Who says I'm guilty of anything? What's your proof? State needs no proof. It is up to you to prove your innocence. Proof is one word you don't use. It's one word you hate.
What is it, freedom?
That word is freedom.
Fucking called it!
What you have seen is not entirely fiction.
Yes, it is. As expected, this film sucks, and this guy is just another capitalist cuck.
It's crazy that they used to be able to indoctrinate people like that. Like, their propaganda has had to get better at least, you know, but at this point, the imperialists just sit on like an absolute throne of lies. Like, there's just lies on top of lies on top of lies. So I feel like it's become harder for them to justify their endless militarism, which is why a lot of the U.S. wars got more covert after Iraq, because the people were really onto what the U.S. empire was doing.
I'm not going to say a word that has.
But yeah, it's crazy how bad and ridiculous some of the McCarthyite imperialism is. Thank you for that. Got a super chat here. In my opinion, we are in a crisis because we reached the high stage, liberal unipolarity of the highest stage of capitalism, but it didn't let us control globalization. That's a good way of putting it, I think. Yeah, we've reached, you know, as I said, imperialism has undergone changes even since Lenin analyzed it, you know, so he called imperialism the highest stage of capitalism. But I agree, I think it's reached an even higher stage to the point where it's undermining itself, like with the U.S., you know, that political comic of the U.S. being the Statue of Liberty, and it's taking bricks out of its own body to throw at other countries. Like, the U.S. has been doing that for a long, long time, and imperialism's starting to undermine itself, both ideologically, you know, they're, as I was saying, they're sitting on a throne of lies, and more people are seeing through the lies, but materially as well. You know, the U.S. empire is no longer able to maintain this material hegemonic global dominance. So imperialism's in crisis. And the U.S. has done everything they can to control globalization, like you said, creating, after World War II, these giant institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, global financial institutions to carry out the U.S.'s interests financially around the world. But they have, they haven't been able to keep every single country in the world under their boot, or with a, US backed puppet dictator, and imperialism starting to crumble as, resistance from the rest of the world continues, and from the masses of the East and the global South continue to rise up against imperial exploitation. Great super chat. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the super chats today. We're getting a whole bunch of good questions. I'm confused. I know he's also been sort of flirting with anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. Who are we talking about here? You guys aren't talking about me, are you? Oh, Taibbi. Okay, you're talking about Matt Taibbi. He's a liberal, right? I'm like, where have I ever given anti-LGBTQ rhetoric? I'm sure I'll get accused of that by liberals at some point, because I like to point out how the CIA and the military-industrial complex uses identity politics rhetoric, or uses the LGBTQ struggles, co-ops them and uses them for imperialist purposes and imperialist propaganda. That does not mean I'm anti-LGBTQ or anti-LGBTQ people. I'm against the co-opting of their struggle in order to support imperialism, which hurts LGBTQ people. You all know that, but I just got a little scared there. I'm like, people accusing me of being a bigot in my own chat? Because you never know. I never know who's out there saying stuff about me, who's out there lying about me or telling the truth. I've had people come to me like, Eddie, like, you hate trans people, right? Jim Bob told me that. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I never said that in my life. So yeah, shit like that. Gotta be careful. I wonder if we lost Comrade Noah. He hasn't hopped in. Oh no, you keep the good word. Thank you. And we've got a lot of new viewers lately. We've brought a lot of new people into our community. For a while, it was slow. We were increasing slowly, but since we've been back on TikTok, we started to grow really fast again. So I have to explain stuff that I kind of, at a certain point, I expect like the chat to kind of know what I'm about and know my basic principles or whatever. But when we add new people, you got to re-explain that, at least occasionally. So something I got to do more, remind people of what my theoretical principles are. Let's watch. Somebody says, Eddie, look at my channel. I will at some point. When the stream is over, though, probably. Because I don't want to pull up a random channel and have it be something horrible. Unless you have something specific you want me to check out. How do you feel about people saying Jimmy Dore isn't a real socialist? Thoughts on him? Oh, we've been talking about Jimmy Dore a bit. He's not like a Marxist. He doesn't read theory, but his positions always, line up with anti-imperialism and socialism more so than most of the new media figures on YouTube, and especially lately. Lately, he's had other people who have been blackballed from the media, from the American imperialist media on his show. People who are staunchly anti-imperialist and Marxist-Leninists, like Danny Haifong. So, yeah, I think Jimmy does a good show. I don't think Jimmy identifies as socialist. Not yet, he doesn't. Wait till I go on his show and I beat him over the head with the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism. Yeah, that's what we were talking about. Taibbi has moved beyond the CIA coups, IDPOL rhetoric to the right wing as a point about LGBTQ groups trying to shove their agenda down our throat. Oh, got you. Yeah, we're not going to get into that right now. The only problematic part about Jimmy is the majority of his audience are anti-LGBTQ of his vocal audience. Oh, really? I don't think that's the majority of his audience. Maybe there are vocal people in his audience like that, but I don't even know if I would say that's true, though, because I check out his comments all the time to see what people are saying, and most of them are pro-LGBTQ, but because Jimmy's pro-LGBTQ, he talks about it all the time, because people say all the time he's anti-LGBTQ, so he'll say, no, here's my positions on it. So, but either way, enough about that. I think it's time that we take on part 2 of my favorite video that I've ever watched. The Cold War 2 oversimplified. We watched the Cold War Part 1. It was one of the worst videos I've ever seen in my life. It made me want to quit doing politics forever. So, I figured we should watch the second one. And maybe this will push me over the edge. And all the neoconservatives and liberals who hate me will rejoice. Because I quit politics. Let's go, baby. I agree, Jacob CT. Let's go.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can...
Someone says, oh, part 2 gets worse? How that possible? How that even possible? Illinois State Fishing says, damn, watching this is going to give me a headache. I think this might be the end of me. I think I might lose my mind here today if this is worse than the last one. But I'll take your word for it. I'm expecting it to be worse now. Prepare for the worst, plan for the worst, hope for the best.
You can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent U.S. history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is...
Sorry, I kind of spaced out at first, but they met at a bar. They were both arrested like 10 years before the Cuban Revolution even launched. I mean, I guess they were conspiring for a long time to overthrow the government, but they definitely didn't meet at a bar and say, hey, we should overthrow the government, and then did it the next day. It's something that they had to wait for the perfect time to do. Something that they were arrested for, like I said, before that even happened. Yeah.
Exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the U.S. immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any U.S. involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending U.S. threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of...
I love how they give no credit to the Cubans. Right, the U.S. trained up these Cuban exiles and tried to invade the country, but because Kennedy didn't send enough air support to bomb the shit out of Cuba, it ended in a Cuban success. But it had nothing to do with the Cuban people wanting to maintain their sovereignty. That doesn't show that the Cuban people are opposed to U.S. militarism and U.S. imperialism. The fact that they defended themselves from this country who's so much larger, from the world's biggest military economic superpower, this small island country was able to defeat them in a battle. But it's just because we didn't send enough planes. When sending a bunch of air support and bombing Cuba may have brought the Soviet Union into the conflict and may have led to World War III. But then after that, they say, and Fidel Castro was still worried about his regime. He was so concerned after the Bay of Pigs about protecting his regime. Was he concerned about his sovereignty, not his regime, after the U.S. tried to invade his country? Yeah, I would be pretty worried about my regime too. If Russia or Canada invaded the United States, do you not think the U.S. State Department and the president should be worried? And would you say that they're worried about protecting their imperialist regime, which is what the U.S. is, or would you say they're worried about defending sovereignty and the democracy of their people, which in the case of Cuba is actually true. The U.S. attacked them and their people defended their sovereignty, and they've been defending against the U.S. empire, defending their sovereignty ever since. The CIA has tried to kill Fidel Castro literally like 600 times. So these people defending their democracy and their sovereignty, that's a regime. The U.S. who invaded them, we're a democracy. We're a democracy, and we actually have sovereignty. Even though there was just recently a democracy study done, and people in Cuba and China said more than anywhere in the world that they feel like they have democracy and control of their government, or at least they were both in the top 10, and the U.S. was near dead last. But we're the democracy. Cuba's a regime. The language and vocabulary of the empire.
medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October.
This is a great example of the great man of history fallacy and why Americans are anti-intellectual, to say it a nice way, or why the American masses are kind of dumb when it comes to politics and what our country does around the world. This is why the great man of history fallacy. There's a big reason why. Fidel Castro met Khrushchev, and they both said, we hate America so much we should be friends and team up to destroy America. Forget the fact that America just invaded Cuba, and Cuba has never, ever attacked or even floated the idea of attacking America in their history. They're the aggressors for defending their country against the exiles who the U.S. trained up and invaded their country with. And then Cuba forged ties with the Soviet Union because Cuba was being run by Fidel by himself, just the one guy. Che was there a little bit, but it was mostly just dictator Fidel and his regime. And then the Soviet Union, this country of millions and millions and millions of people, this giant country, was being run by Khrushchev himself somehow. And then they found time in between running their entire country by themselves, running their regime by themselves, to meet up. They went for coffee, and they said, you hate America, right? Khrushchev asked Fidel. Fidel said, yeah, I hate America. They just invaded my country. And then they said, let's team up to destroy them. That's what happened. No, America put Cuba, after they failed to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, they put Cuba under the most stringent economic sanction regime in history, tied with the embargo or the sanctions that the U.S. has kept on the DPRK since killing 20% of their population in the Korean War. The embargo against Cuba and the embargo against the DPRK are most stringent of any sanctions or embargoes anywhere in the world. So the U.S. surrounded Cuba with their navy and their military, and they said, you cannot trade with anyone else in the world. You cannot trade. If you try and trade, we're going to intercept it with our military and navy. We're going to say you're, defying sanctions, and then we, have right to attack you or whatever. So Cuba has had to construct socialism, and they've, massively decreased illiteracy, malnutrition, given their people universal health care, brought health care and health facilities to rural areas that never before had them in the past. They've done this while being under this horrible economic embargo. But the Soviet Union, a socialist country, said, we don't care about the U.S.'s embargo. We're going to ally with Cuba and we'll buy sugar from them. And the USSR bought way more sugar from Cuba than what they really needed, because Cuba for years had been colonized by U.S. multinational corporations and the U.S. government. So their country, or their soil, was very monocropic. The soil, after having the same thing planted in it over and over again by these transnational corporations, who weren't reinvesting in developing Cuba's land, but were taking the wealth created by the Cuban soil and accumulating it in the West, that soil became monocropic, so it could only grow one thing. So Cuba can mostly only grow sugar and tobacco, and the Soviet Union says, no worries, we'll buy all your sugar, even despite the U.S. embargo. So for years, Cuba's economic construction and their socialist construction is largely financed by the Soviet Union, who they're selling sugar to in order to avoid the U.S. embargo. And when the Soviet Union dissolves in the early 90s, it's basically a disaster for Cuba economically. Fidel tells the people, we're not going to be as rich as we were. We have to diversify our economy and find a way to do this without the Soviet Union's help. And they did. They went through the economic struggles. People fled Cuba quite a bit during that time, but, they were able to bring their economy back to life without the Soviet Union, even in the face of the U.S. embargo, and remain socialist, remain a Marxist country against U.S. imperialism, defying the U.S. empire just, a few miles away. So now think of that complex story that I just told you about how the actions of the U.S. empire affected the Cuban economy, Cuban production, which Marx tells us to start our analysis from production. That prevented Cuba from developing production and expanding production. So they had to go, because of that U.S. embargo, had to go to the Soviet Union and trade sugar, which had many, many other economic effects on the people of Cuba. What makes more sense and sounds like a better history of Cuba, a more detailed and accurate history of Cuba? What I just told you, which is all true and which is what actually happened, or what this video with millions of views just told you, that Fidel and Khrushchev met up for coffee one day and decided to try and destroy the U.S.? Which story seems more realistic? Because the story that I told you, the true story, the story that goes into the interrelation between economics, politics, foreign policy, trade, all of this, that's the true story. And this oversimplified story is nonsense, but this is the story Americans believe. This is the one everyone believes. They think that all socialist countries were just run by these dictators who decided to try and destroy America one day for fun. As America is sending, planes to bomb Cuba and training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba, we're calling them the aggressors. So Americans don't have an idea of what politics actually are, right? How production affects politics, what American foreign policy is, why other countries have different interests than us. We don't understand this. We think countries are just run by leaders. And every leader who the U.S. tries to destroy or overthrow or bomb is just an evil comic book villain, teaming up with all the other evil comic book villains to destroy American freedom. And it's absurd. And this is why Americans don't understand politics and why I want to bash my head into a wall every day.
Idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The U.S. Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for their Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba.
Someone says, I love how there's no mention of the fact that there are already nukes in Turkey. Right, they just mention that as, all U.S. imperialist propaganda does. They only mention that when it becomes part of the story. And the U.S. said they'd remove their nukes from Turkey. Wait a second. So the U.S. had nukes in Turkey? So the U.S. was already pointing nukes at the Soviet Union and invading Cuba with our air raids and training up Cuban exiles. But then when Cuba wants bombs or nukes for self-defense, after the U.S. invades them, that's reason to almost push the world into World War III, into nuclear apocalypse. Yet the U.S. is allowed to surround the Soviet Union with nukes, and we're not even going to talk about it? It's crazy. Now you see how they, how they lie by omission in order to push a certain narrative. It's not necessarily that they're just making up pure blatant lies all the time. A lot of times they'll lie by omission to not give you the full context of what's going on. Right? They'll be like, the Soviet Union was trying to send nukes to Cuba for no reason. Well, hold on. The U.S. had just invaded Cuba and surrounded the Soviet Union's borders with nukes. So that kind of justifies this a whole lot more.
And the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the...
Yeah, that explains Brezhnev. They got rid of Khrushchev because he sucked, by the way.
Prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms...
He didn't suck. He's still better than every U.S. president at the time. But compared to Stalin and even Brezhnev, not ideal.
race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they'd be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you going to do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight.
Maybe they didn't actually lose their bombs. How do we lose so many bombs? What is that? Is that just what the U.S. says when they want to put a nuclear weapon in like Israel or something, but they don't want to tell anyone about it? Which, by the way, Israel has nuclear weapons, as the U.S. and Israel are trying to attack Iran, claiming that Iran is creating nuclear weapons when Iran agreed to have their nuclear arsenal monitored 24/7 by an International Atomic Energy Agency, who never once in the time when they were monitoring Iran accused Iran of making a nuclear weapon. And the U.S. gives Israel nuclear weapons and then says, we need to attack Iran because of nukes. When, historically, nukes have been like the one way that countries have been able to get the U.S. to not invade them and not destroy them, get the U.S. up their backs. But yeah, is that what the U.S. says when they want to give a nuke to somewhere like Israel? Like, oh, we lost it. Yeah, sorry about that. The hydrogen bombs, we dropped those on our way over here. They're somewhere. What the heck? And then they're like, the Soviet Union didn't drop any, or they didn't lose any hydrogen bombs. So that means they could be anywhere. Like, what the hell are you talking about? How are you taking the U.S. losing a bunch of hydrogen bombs, losing a bunch of incredibly devastating weapons and nuclear reactive weapons around the world, and then blaming that on somehow finding a way to put that on the Soviet Union because they didn't lose a bunch of nuclear weapons? Like, oh, we don't know how many they lost. Maybe they didn't lose a bunch of nuclear bombs because they're not this giant destabilizing empire that stretches across the world with thousands of military bases and U.S. spy planes flying over everyone they don't like. When you don't do that, it's probably easier to keep track of your bombs, I guess. I don't know. I've never run an imperialist or socialist military before.
After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist.
No, it wasn't divided into two. Nobody liked the anti-communist regime in the south. It was U.S.-backed and armed right-wingers who nobody supported, which is why the U.S. had to go and do Vietnam. And then after the U.S. left Vietnam, still nobody supported these people, and they chased them out literally as the U.S. was leaving. The Vietnamese chased out the U.S. puppet government in Saigon.
Regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the North established the national...
It's the same thing what they did with Korea. You don't get to say that Kim Il-sung and Ho Chi Minh were evil, ruthless dictators because they wanted to reunite their country when you occupied half their country. If Russia came and occupied half the United States, killed millions of our people, and started stealing all our resources and backing fascist right-wing groups in the United States, and then somebody from the West or from the other half of the United States that wasn't occupied by Russia said, hey, we should take our own land back, that's not being a ruthless dictator. That's called defending your country from imperialism and imperialist aggression, which is what Ho Chi Minh did. And it's incredibly inspiring. And the U.S. Did horrific amounts of damage in Vietnam, left so many dead and so much trauma, destroyed the infrastructure of Vietnam, made a very easy transition into socialism, a very difficult transition into socialism by bombing all their agriculture and industry and getting their soil filled with Agent Orange and napalm and all these other toxic chemicals. And then Ho Chi Minh fights against that, and that makes him a ruthless dictator. Shut the hell up. Shut the hell up. You're an idiot. You're a chauvinist idiot. Whoever made this video.
National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The U.S. sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong, and over the next decade, the situation escalated.
More and more South Vietnamese supported the Viet. They always supported the Viet Minh. It's not the Viet Cong. That's literally a pejorative that the U.S. military came up with to call these people when they were there trying to massacre them and occupy their country. Started calling them the Kongs when it's actually the Viet Minh. And the South never had any support. You know, they never had any real grassroots support, the same way South Korea never had any grassroots support, which is why the U.S. eventually ended up doing wars in both places. It's literally the exact same as Korea, where everybody was like, no, we support Ho Chi Minh. We don't support the U.S.-backed fascist groups or occupied Vietnam. So they started liberating their own country, and that's when the U.S. started bombing everybody. But apparently Ho Chi Minh's the dictator for that, not Henry Kissinger and the evil pieces of garbage who leveled a huge percentage of Vietnam and Korea with bombs because they wanted their independence.
To a breaking point, America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found its...
Losing South Vietnam. America had to send in the troops or we would lose South Vietnam. What do you mean lose it? It's not fucking ours. It's Vietnam. It literally, it's in the name. Vietnam. It belongs to the Vietnamese. What do you mean we had to send in troops or we would lose it? First of all, you just said South Vietnam was its own independent thing. You know, it wasn't an artificial government propped up by the U.S. and U.S. intelligence agencies, which it was. But then you say that, you know, once the North came into the South, that's when the U.S. was forced to send their troops. Otherwise, we would lose South Vietnam. I thought it wasn't ours. I thought it was just South Vietnam. And why does the U.S. have the right to invade countries or we might lose them? What do you mean by that? I mean, I know this is propaganda, and whoever came up with this probably knows what they're doing, right? They probably know that they're creating propaganda. But how, as a normal person, could you read the script of this and be like, this is, and not be like, this is ridiculous. This is the most ridiculous shit I've ever read. The U.S. needed to invade Vietnam or they would lose South Vietnam. It's not ours. It's Vietnam. Again, using the same example, if Vietnam took over half the United States and then the half that wasn't took over said we should go get the rest of the United States back, get the rest of our territory back, would the U.S. media portray them as evil dictators for doing that? Would they say Vietnam needed to send in their troops at that point in order to get the eastern United States back? No country even thinks like that or would suggest such a ludicrous thing, because no country thinks like the United States. No country is as arrogant as the U.S. empire and thinks that, you can invade countries and destroy their infrastructure and agriculture and bomb children and blow up their schools, as long as it lets you keep half the country for yourself because it's ours. Yeah, we're the U.S. We can take every country we want. No.
Itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder.
That's what you call the crossfire. You call Operation Rolling Thunder crossfire. The U.S. invaded their country, occupied the South, and then started bombing the shit out of the North the same way that they did to North Korea, dropping tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm, leaving the country toxic and leaving their farmland toxic for years, making it extremely difficult for them to grow food even after the U.S. left. That's civilians getting caught in the crossfire? No. And if you learn about Vietnam specifically, the tactics of the Viet Minh were so good, the guerrilla warfare tactics, because they understood the jungle and they understood their own homeland. The Americans eventually didn't know what to do, and they were scared all the time that they were going to get ambushed or whatever else. So they just started bombing and lighting on fire like vast swaths of jungle, right? And there are tons of examples of U.S. just blatant massacres of women and children in Vietnam, probably because, you know, they didn't know who they were fighting, right? A lot of times people would dress as women and children, but then they would be soldiers and they would attack the U.S. You want to know why? Because the U.S. was invading and occupying their country. So they knew how their country worked. They knew where to hide. They knew how to do military operations. And the U.S. just kept drafting young people and sending them to go fight and die in this death trap. And then we bomb millions of acres of farmland and kill countless numbers of people in the north in Operation Rolling Thunder. And this propaganda nonsense is like, oh, that's just people getting caught in the crossfire. No, that's people being directly targeted. People's land and territory and political system being directly targeted for takeover by the U.S. empire. And then the U.S. empire killing as many young American people, young American soldiers drafted into the military as they need to, and killing as many people in Vietnam as they need to, and destroying as much of Vietnam's economy as they need to in order to do it, in order to take this place over. That's what this is. It's not crossfire between two equal sides. It is the imperialist slaughter of the heroic Viet Minh people who defeated the U.S. and maintained their economic and political sovereignty. That's what the Vietnam War was.
The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua.
How is this not the same thing? How is this not the same thing that the U.S. was doing in South Vietnam? It's just the same thing, but the U.S. didn't, end up going in and bombing half the country and destroying the entire country's infrastructure and killing 20% of people the same way they did in Korea and Vietnam. But that doesn't mean they won't do it. They did the same thing in Iraq. A lot of what would happen was the Soviet Union and China were part of the UN Security Council. And when that was created, like the first 58 vetoes, because any country in the Security Council has veto power, was the Soviet Union vetoing the US trying to bomb some country or trying to invade some country. The Soviet Union would say, no, you can't do that via the UN Security Council. So, a lot of the U.S.'s death and destruction came from people realizing how messed up Vietnam was and how evil the U.S.'s actions were in Vietnam and how destructive they were. So they had to slow down with just bombing countries to oblivion, the same way they did to Korea and Vietnam. Because it didn't work. Both those countries remain communist and socialist and are going to hate the U.S. forever because of what the U.S. has done there. So that didn't work. So they tried to start doing things more covertly. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, immediately, you have the beginning of the Gulf War. And the U.S. You have the bombing and carpet bombing of Yugoslavia and the destruction of Yugoslavia. You have all these different proxy wars that the U.S. has been doing around the world, which now become like hot wars, right? Which become actual U.S. military occupations. And that's, again, slowed down in recent years. But it's largely the Soviet Union and China who were combating this every step of the way. Not so much China at this point. But a lot of the times, the reason the U.S. wasn't able to just send troops into Nicaragua the way they had in the past was because of the Soviet Union. But they act like these are just equal powers, just backing proxy wars around the world. And no. You got a super chat here. Is there a comprador ultra left in the West? People like Paul Mason. That's a good question. Well, I'll answer that question after we finish about half this video. Yeah, we're about done here.
Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this became this, and this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made...
So I should point out that this is wrong too. The CIA was largely supporting the hippie movement. And the U.S. just found that their wars in Vietnam... I mean, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. continued the Vietnam War for years, continued bombing their people and their infrastructure for years after they knew they were going to lose. The U.S. knew they had no chance of occupying or turning Vietnam capitalist, but they continued to bomb them out of spite and to try and make Vietnam, make transitioning to socialism as hard as they possibly could make it for Vietnam. So, it had the withdrawal from these wars wasn't just the hippie movement in the U.S. forcing the government to withdraw from these wars. It was the U.S. empire changing strategy. The same way them pulling out of Afghanistan wasn't because of any protests or anything we did here at home. I mean, the hippie movement was larger than the Afghanistan protests. But what I'm saying is that the CIA was actually supporting the hippie movement through various things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which you can Google. Because they didn't want people to be socialists and communists. They didn't want people to see, hey, our government, our imperialist capitalist government is killing, massacring, and destroying any country who tries to become socialist, like Korea or Vietnam abroad. So we should become socialist and turn America into a socialist country so we can have a foreign policy of mutual development. And we can work together with countries like Vietnam instead of sending all our young people to fight and die and get PTSD in a horrific war while bombing the country to oblivion. We should trade with them and be allies with them, socialist foreign policy. And the way to do that is through class struggle, engaging in class struggle in the U.S. so we can eventually have a revolution in the U.S. The U.S. State Department did not want people thinking like that. But there was a huge anti-war sentiment in the U.S. as people were watching the Vietnam War on their TVs for the first time and seeing the destruction firsthand. So the U.S. State Department and the CIA did everything they could to get people to join the hippie movement, including, putting drugs and LSD onto the streets. Did everything they could to get people to join that instead of the socialist movement. So then you hear, that idea that once you become, once you grow up, you won't be left wing anymore. You'll be right wing once you get a real job and become an adult. That largely started with the hippie movement, because you had a lot of people who were thinking, make love, not war. Let's just go to Woodstock and roll in the grass all day, and Vietnam's bad, and that'll end the war. Instead of, hardcore socialist, communist organizing workers, the masses, theoretically, as well as materially and economically and ideologically, organizing them in order to fight the imperialist ruling class, in order to identify the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, as the ruling class and the state as their tool, and then to fight and struggle against it. That's not what the State Department wanted. And so they push people into the hippie movement, which is more like, let's just, we'll all go to Woodstock and hold up, make love, not war signs, and eventually the war will go away. It's very disorganized, disjointed. And then, a lot of those hippies grew up and got real jobs that sucked and where they're getting exploited every day. And they're like, oh, this is just the way of the world, and a lot of them are like Republicans now. There's so many Republicans today, conservatives today, who are in the hippie movement. And they'll tell you like, oh, once you grow up and get a job, like then you'll be a right-wing conservative. It's like, no, because I have the science of Marxism-Leninism. I'm not just some hippie who saw Vietnam happen on TV and got angry about it for 5 minutes. The more I work, the more I understand exploitation, right? The more I understand that my labor is being used to create wealth for somebody else who's not putting in any labor. And that there's a much, much better, more rational way to organize labor within our society. I learned that the more I work. I learned that more the older I get. Versus a lot of the hippies did not learn that. And then, a lot of them are conservatives now. Which is why the CIA supported it. Congress for Cultural Freedom. Give it a Google.
And turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers.
The South immediately fell. The U.S. just likes to say that it lasted for a while.
In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did
they weren't hungry. The Soviet Union was having to put a lot of money into their military budget, more than they wanted, to stop the U.S. from destroying them. And the consumer goods thing was real. Like, U.S. propaganda was saying, socialist countries don't have consumer goods, and socialist countries were producing, most of what they used, and they were focusing less on producing consumer goods for people to buy. Whereas, they were focusing more on the essentials in countries like Cuba, especially, who are under economic embargo and who are smaller, not superpowers like the Soviet Union. And, consumerism kind of became intertwined with imperialism at this point. The U.S. propaganda was saying, look at all the consumerism of the Western world. And a lot of people in socialist countries sort of fell into this idea, right? That, maybe, capitalism is way richer and our government's just lying to us and we're going to get all these consumer goods. And that's a big part of the reason, so many old people in the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union, 75% of people who lived in the Soviet Union now want a return to that economic model. Because once they actually got capitalism, they realized that the West had lied, that they got consumer goods, but also it was a human rights disaster in the Soviet Union. You had unemployment, which hadn't existed forever, went up to 20%. Malnutrition went up. Drugs and sex trafficking flowed back over the border, which hadn't existed under socialism. So they got all the crappy parts of capitalism too. And that's why you have the saying of former Soviet citizens, everything our government told us about communism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism was true. So maybe, we didn't establish the dream of communism. We didn't establish a stateless, classless society. That's what they're saying. That part wasn't true. And our government told us that for sure we were marching towards that. But everything they told us about capitalism was true. They told us that in the U.S., there's, vast wealth. There's tons of consumer goods, but there's people living on the streets, and there's people going hungry. And there's people experiencing mental health crises in all the cities on the streets, and nobody helps them. Nobody takes care of them. You just walk by and continue with your own life. That's kind of the kind of society Americans have. And Russians saw that, and they saw that society versus the old socialist society. And now 75% of them are like, oh, the socialist society was better. All right, we'll watch this. We'll watch one more little segment here.
They have to show for it. They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in
Was through ping pong? Dude, who even wrote this? It was China's market reforms. Again, with them just ignoring the economic factors. Same thing as with Cuba, where they said that the leader of Cuba, Fidel, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, just met up and they hate America, so they teamed up. No, it was because Cuba was under an embargo and the Soviet Union was the only people who would buy their sugar. In the U.S. under China under Mao had closed off their economy, but under Deng, they were saying, we're going to open up our economy to investment from the outside world, and we're going to control that investment and continue trying to construct socialism. So the U.S. was like, oh, yeah, money, 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 money. We'll definitely invest in China. And they just assumed at this point that China had gone capitalist, China had gone liberal, which is not true. If you read what the Chinese scholars and Marxists are saying, that's never been the case. That's never been what's known as the market reforms and opening up were about. But the market reforms and opening up are why Nixon went there. Relations between China and the U.S. didn't change at this time because of ping pong. You see what I mean by this great man of history stuff is why the U.S. citizens are uninformed and sometimes come off as just straight up dumb. There's complicated reasons, extremely complicated reasons for why the U.S. was now more willing to work together with China economically versus under Mao before. But you're going to just say it was ping pong? Dude, you make our whole country a joke. If someone else who has any kind of understanding of history saw this and was like, this is how Americans learn history. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. They just kind of believe anything. Like, it's a joke. Ping pong. The market reforms in China were ping pong. Okay, so I'll get to the super chat now from RD Doctor. Thank you for another super chat and your continued support. Is there a comprador ultra left in the West? People like Paul Mason, Orwell, Hitchens, Sockman, Harrington. I think those are just controlled opposition. So I guess you could call them comprador if you want. I guess comprador is kind of a different thing, though. Comprador is usually the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie in a country that the U.S. is doing imperialism towards, or that imperialism is exploiting. And then there's, capitalists who benefit off that in the home country, and they work together with the imperialists. They're compradors. In the West, I don't think these people are leftists at all. They are imperialists. They are tied to the State Department, but they're controlled opposition. They're pretending to be leftists while spreading imperialist ideology to infiltrate left-wing groups with the same ideology and ideas, or ideas and ideology that benefit the U.S. empire. So that's what people like Paul Mason do. That's what George Orwell did. That's what Christopher Hitchens did when he had a famous debate with Parenti, arguing that the U.S. needed to invade Iraq to stop the spread of Muslim extremist ideology, which the U.S. had been funding and supporting in the Middle East for years, as we talked about. So yeah, I call those people controlled opposition, and that is not a new strategy. That is not a new strategy at all. The COINTELPRO was the U.S. infiltrating groups like the Black Panthers and other socialist groups way back, dismantling those groups from the inside, getting people within those groups who preach nonsense. And you have to be aware of that as a leftist, because we blame a lot of stuff on the CIA, because over time it's been revealed that the CIA has done a lot of horrible stuff. But one, we don't even know everything the CIA has done, or even close. A lot of it's still covered up. And two, we can't assume that the CIA has stopped doing this stuff, or the NAD, or the Department of Homeland Security and the Disinformation Board, or whatever arms of the U.S. State Department are formed or acting to suppress people. We can't assume that they've just stopped infiltrating left-wing groups. Controlled opposition has been one of the most successful ways that the U.S. State Department has stopped socialist organization in the home country for years. And they're definitely still doing it, especially when a lot of our organizing is happening over social media, when a lot of our organizing is happening online. The State Department is 100% using bot accounts or astroturfing certain tweets, meaning giving tweets a bunch of likes in order to encourage people to tweet more stuff like that. Because, through social media, you can manipulate people who are good communists into saying dumb imperialist things. Like, just use, if you're the CIA and I can set up some program that gives someone 100 bot likes every time I click like on their tweet, I'm going to find leftist socialists saying pro-imperialist stuff and then boost those tweets, which I feel like you see all the time. And then because of the dopamine response you get when you tweet something that gets a lot of likes, socialists, people who consider themselves leftists, are then encouraged to say more imperialist stuff because it gets a lot of likes. Versus the anti-imperialist stuff is the stuff that a lot of times doesn't get likes, or a lot of times gets you hate, or a lot of times gets your TikTok account banned from TikTok. R.I.P. the Eddie Liger Smith account. Be aware of this when you see calls for violence right away. Yes. I have been seeing this lately too. Like, let's go attack all the politicians for Roe v. Wade. Like, no. Let's organize ourselves. Organize, educate, struggle. Not just random attacks. That's going to get people killed. That's going to make all of our organizations look unorganized, bad, and terroristic. That's literally just terrorism, which is anti-communist, anti-socialist. Anytime that you call for insurrection, for overthrowing the government, you need to be absolutely sure you can win. and then absolutely sure that you're going to follow it through to the end. That's what Marx says, And one of the most harmful things you can do is try for or call for an insurrection before the masses of society are ready or before they want a revolution, because you can get a lot of people killed. Yeah. And then there's like in Cuba, the communists in the cities in Cuba were saying to Che Guevara, you're an adventurist, right? You want to start an insurrection or a revolution, but the people aren't ready. We need to wait for feudalism to go away and for capitalism to fully develop in Cuba and for the proletariat, the working class in the cities to fully develop. And then we can have a revolution once things develop naturally. And Che said, no, capitalism's highest stage is imperialism. Imperialism prevents capitalism from developing in countries like Cuba. It keeps them as semi-feudal countries. Plus, the Bolsheviks in China have showed us that you can have a worker-peasant alliance. We can have the feudal peasants in the countryside team up with the workers in the city to overthrow the capitalists and the landowners and the imperialists in the case of Cuba and Vietnam. So I would say there, the Che was calling for an insurrection, to overthrow the imperialist-backed government, the capitalist government, versus the communists were saying, no. And clearly Che was right, because the revolution was successful and the peasants joined his side, and Cuba's socialist to this day. They overthrew Batista. So it goes both ways, but the U.S. is not even close to ready for anything like that. Thank you for pointing that out. This is something ultra-leftists don't understand. I know, and I just like when people are calling for like insurrection or like attacking anything, I'm like, just are you really picturing in your head how that's gonna go? How that's gonna play out if a bunch of people from DSA go attack someplace that's owned by the U.S. government. They're gonna get destroyed, or in jail, or imprisoned. So yeah, and that's why you got to be careful when you read stuff like that. Just think in your head, maybe that's controlled opposition, right? And I'm not saying you need to be hyper paranoid and think everybody's a spy or everyone's controlled opposition, but some people are. Some people are, and a good sign of it is if they're like, yeah, let's overthrow the government tomorrow. It's like the Bolsheviks didn't even go on strikes. They didn't even do general strikes randomly. Everything was concentrated, organized, and prepared. And the party and the masses, or the party acted based on what the sentiment was within the masses. And when they acted, they did it in a unified way, right? So we have like a Facebook meme that says, we need a general strike. And it goes viral. There's a meme like that goes viral like every month or so. And people are calling for a general strike because a general strike would be a good idea, but it's only a good idea if you're organized. Right? You can't just call for a bunch of general strike or call for like 18 general strikes a year, right? When you call for a general strike, it has to be the right time. And then you have to have enough people who are organized and educated and are ready to do the general strike and are ready to make specific demands. Because once you actually do an action like this, you want to follow it through to the end. And then you want to try and, achieve something out of whatever action that you're carrying out. And then that's when you make your assessment. You look back and you say, okay, in retrospect, here's what we did. Here's what we achieved. Here's what we could have done better. Here's how changing something, a part of what we did would have changed what we achieved or what we were able to achieve. This is all just, very basic organization and strategy and tactics. And yeah, there's like none of that. We're just very disorganized, which I think right now in the US might be like a pre-revolutionary period, right? The contradictions of imperialism are increasing. Conditions for workers are getting worse and worse, and workers are becoming more class conscious as a result. So the key right now is to get people into organizations, and get people training themselves theoretically, so we can engage in centralized, focused, intelligent strategy and tactics to get rid of the imperialist oligarchs who run our country. There is a global proletarian movement of striking action right now. We ought to support it. Yeah. And when the John Deere workers went on strike, I was like on the picket lines with them, as much as I could be, supporting them. That was in the Midwest. John Deere makes tractors and farming components, so there are like just disunited strikes popping up, random labor strikes. And yes, those are exactly the kind of thing you should go to and try and reach those people with theoretical education. Right? Like, yes, I support you in your struggle against the boss. Now it's time for theoretical and anti-imperialist education so we can continue to organize and really change, the relation between you and your boss. Right on, Eddie. Yeah, you bet. Well, I think I'm going to head out, y'all. It's been a great 3 hours. We've had a great audience this whole time. Almost, like just under 100 people the whole time. So really, really enjoying these streams, especially now that we have so many great people in the chat, tuning in, sending videos, all that stuff. If people haven't been putting stuff on here yet, but we do have a Reddit. If you want to see some stuff on stream, or if you want to see something specific on stream, post it on Reddit. Here, you can just post it to Reddit, or you can leave it as a response to this post. Oh, this isn't the subreddit. This is that specific post. Here's the subreddit. So yeah, here's our Midwestern Marks Reddit. I've been checking this so that we can, if y'all want to leave videos or articles or news stories, whatever, post them here, and I'll start getting to them on the stream. If you want me to watch it with Carlos or with Noah or something, make sure you say that in your post. But yeah, that's all I got for today. So thanks for hanging out, y'all. Much love, solidarity.